Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're drifting off beneath a warm blanket, walking alone beneath amber streetlights, or watching the trees sway from a quiet window, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're entering a time when the very air could spark a fire, and giants ruled the shadows beneath the trees. This is calm storytelling for deep-time dreamers. This is the untold story of an atmosphere unlike anything we breathe today. Over 300 million years ago, the world was lit by lightning and fed by air thick with oxygen. And in that charged silence, life grew vast and strange. But what if this isn't just a story of big bugs and burning forests, but of a planet that once breathed too deeply? And, if you're the kind of curious soul who finds beauty in prehistoric swamps and the sound of scientific mystery, consider tapping like and subscribe. It really does help this kind of storytelling reach more quiet minds like yours. Oh, and before we begin, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it right now? If you feel like sharing in the comments, it's always a joy to see how far and wide this story travels. Also, it's okay to fall asleep. You'll find chapter markers in the description if you ever want to return. Now, we begin with the fire-breathing forest. It would have smelled like rot, like bark soaked in stagnant water, damp ferns, pollen-heavy air, the kind that clings to your lungs and sits behind your eyes. If you stood there 310 million years ago, you would not have recognized the world as Earth. And yet, this place bore the slow, sticky heartbeat of a forest planet. No flowers yet, no birdsong, no mammals in the underbrush, only the hiss of wind in club mosses, the height of buildings, and the distant crackle of fire. The trees weren't really trees at all, not in the way we know them. Lepidodendron, Sigillaria. Their trunks were hollow tubes of soft wood and thick bark, rising over 100 feet into a dim green canopy. The leaves, when they fell, didn't flutter like modern leaves. They dropped heavy and wet, stacking into mats that drowned oxygen-starved soils. The light was strange, filtered, more yellow than gold. This was a low-lying, swamp-wrapped earth. Shallow seas came and went. Land rose and sank with tectonic breath. Across much of what we now call North America and Europe, it was forest from horizon to horizon. Forest that never ended, forest that exhaled. And the air was alive. Today, we breathe a mix of gases, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, the rest, a trace cocktail of carbon dioxide, argon, and whispers. But in this time, the late Carboniferous oxygen didn't just hover at 21%. It soared. Atmospheric oxygen likely reached 30 to 35%. A chemical shift so enormous it remade everything that walked, crawled, or flickered into being. With that much oxygen, every breath was more potent, more energizing, more dangerous. The air itself became a kind of fuel, and fuel needs only one thing to become fire. Sometimes, the lightning would strike dry, a single flash across a hilltop, and suddenly the forest would bloom with flames. Megafires, infernos the size of countries, not slow burns, but towering walls of combustion, devouring canopy, bark, and beast alike. We know this not because the trees whispered it to us, but because their scars remain. Layers of fossilized charcoal buried deep in coal seams. Black bands that ripple through the rock record, like singed fingerprints. Scientists have mapped these patterns across the world, in formations stretching from Pennsylvania to Poland. Clues from an ancient sky that caught fire, again and again. Insects, too, felt the change. On the tree trunks, you might spot the wide, slow crawl of a millipede longer than your leg, or hear the dry, papery flutter of wings as a dragonfly with a 2-foot span passed overhead. Meganeura, a predator of the air, heavier than any insect alive today. Creatures like this could only exist when the very air was their accomplice. Why? Because insects don't breathe like we do. They have no lungs, no diaphragm, only a network of tiny tubes, tracheae, that bring air directly to their tissues. This works beautifully when the air is rich in oxygen, and fails completely when it is not. So when Earth inhaled deeply, life grew big, bold, unafraid. And yet, that same breath held fire in waiting. A single spark. That's all it took. In a forest built of bark and peat, laced with oxygen-rich air, fire didn't just spread, it exploded. Scientists have tried to model what these ancient wildfires might have looked like. Not with perfect certainty, but with enough data to understand the scale. And the conclusion is always the same. Fires in the Carboniferous were not like ours. They were faster, taller, deadlier. Even damp plant matter, the kind that today would smoulder and fizzle, caught quickly in this supercharged atmosphere. With 35% oxygen in the air, the ignition threshold dropped. Flames didn't need the driest tinder. They just needed a path. And in this forest, everything was a path. Canopy, mid-layer, undergrowth, peat, fallen trunks, the trees themselves. We see the shadows of this violence in a strange kind of fossilized charcoal. Not ash, which is easily swept away by time, but blackened, baked remains of ancient plants that burned hot enough to carbonize, then cooled without decaying. These remains are known as inertinite, and they make up a surprisingly large fraction of Carboniferous coal seams. Inertinite tells us not just that fires occurred, but that they were frequent, intense, and global. Some coal beds are composed of up to 70% inertinite. Layer after layer. That means entire forests burned over and over again, and still managed to grow back. The planet was both crematorium and cradle. It's hard to imagine standing there on ground still warm from a firestorm watching the next wave of spores drift in like smoke, settling into ash. But the fossil record suggests that's what happened. Again and again. And the scale of it all. That's what startles us most. Modern wildfires, even the largest ones, are often limited by terrain, humidity, or lack of fuel. But in the Carboniferous, there were no deserts to stop the flames, no flowering plants with thick, wet leaves to slow the blaze. The land was covered in unbroken tracts of flammable growth. Swamps, yes, but swamps filled with combustible peat and dense vegetation. When one of these fires started, it could leap across miles in hours. Fuel was everywhere. The atmosphere fed it. Even the weather might have changed in its wake. Some models suggest that these ancient megafires could alter regional climate, rising smoke, blocking sunlight, triggering shifts in rainfall. Entire ecosystems, pressed by fire and regrowth, learned to survive in cycles of destruction. And in the charred remains, life found new footholds. Ferns and lycopsids that germinated in heat-scored soil, amphibians that hunted in temporary ponds left behind by storms, insects that returned to the blackened trunks and laid their eggs in cooling bark. What we call catastrophe. Life once called rhythm. Still, the question lingers. How could such fragile forms persist in such violence? Perhaps the answer lies in what the forest was becoming, a kind of evolutionary engine. Not in spite of the fires, but because of them. There's a strange paradox buried in these trees. On the one hand, the Carboniferous forest was the very definition of abundance. Light filtered endlessly through overlapping canopies. Carbon dioxide levels were lower than today, but still high enough to feed vast photosynthetic engines. Plants didn't flower, but they didn't need to. They towered in spirals of green, reproducing with clouds of spores that drifted like mist through the underworld. On the other hand, it was a fragile abundance. Much of the forest's architecture was built on soft tissue, thin cell walls, delicate structures, bark far thicker than wood. The trees grew fast, but they weren't sturdy. They cracked under their own weight. Their roots were shallow. Their lives were short. But collectively, they changed the air. As dead plant matter piled into peat, and peat compressed into coal, carbon was locked away. Oxygen, the byproduct of photosynthesis, had nowhere to go but up. With so much organic matter being buried instead of decayed, oxygen levels surged. This is the quiet chemistry behind the world's breath, what scientists call the burial hypothesis. The more carbon you bury, the more oxygen you keep, and so Earth kept breathing in. It's possible that no vertebrate not before or since has known air quite like that. A breath that could feel electric. Some estimates suggest that, for creatures adapted to this world, even a single inhalation delivered a rush that modern animals cannot experience. Every heartbeat could run hotter, every movement more efficient. This explains the size. We've already met Meganeura, the dragonfly with a wingspan wider than a hawk's, but it wasn't alone. There were also Arthropleura, armored millipedes, as long as small cars, sliding through the underbrush like ancient tanks, and giant scorpions, and monstrous silverfish. Some of these animals would be comical today, absurd exaggerations of creatures we now swat away with boredom, but in this atmosphere, they made sense. Oxygen doesn't just power muscles, it limits them, especially for animals without lungs. Insects rely on diffusion air entering through spiracles, moving passively along internal tubes. This works well when oxygen is abundant, but poorly when it is scarce. There's a hard ceiling on how big they can get, unless that ceiling rises. During the Carboniferous, the ceiling didn't just rise, it disappeared, and so evolution surged forward into empty space, not for competition, not for war, but simply because it could. Insects had no predators large enough to hunt them yet. Amphibians ruled the swamps, but they lumbered and lurked. The skies belonged to wings, the trunks to crawling plates, the ground to a choreography of creeping giants. It's humbling to realize that we owe this world, this green, flammable, thunder-drenched world, for much of the coal that still powers our own machines. The Carboniferous laid the fuel beneath our cities, but it gave something else too. It showed what happens when nature pushes the accelerator all the way down, when atmosphere becomes invitation, when oxygen becomes a revolution. But revolutions are never simple. For all its gifts, high oxygen came with a cost. And the forest, though lush and endlessly alive, lived on a knife's edge. Every thunderstorm was a threat, every dry season a fuse. In the Carboniferous, lightning was not just a spectacle, it was a sentence. And yet, something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface. Every time a fire tore through the forest, the land changed. Not just in structure, but in chemistry. Ash settled into the soil. Heat cracked seed shells open. Nutrients returned in sudden waves, favoring some species over others. Fires, though terrifying, were agents of renewal. We see this in the way the fossilized plant record shifts. After major fire events identified by thick inertinite bands, we find different plant communities emerging. Fast-recovering species. Opportunists. Ferns and lycopsids that thrived in disturbance. Their spores appear in great abundance in layers just above charcoal zones. It's almost as if fire was a form of natural selection, testing not just what could survive, but what could return. And still, the air fed the flame. It's important to understand how oxygen transforms fire. In today's atmosphere, flames reach a certain temperature and size before becoming self-limiting. There's only so much oxygen to pull from, but at 35%, flames burn hotter, faster, and taller. Some experimental data suggests that even wet vegetation could ignite under those conditions. Sparks became infernos, trees became torches. Even the rain could not always stop it. This brings us to a difficult question. Could any ecosystem be stable in such volatility? Some researchers believe that the very forests responsible for oxygen's rise ultimately sowed their own destruction. As more carbon was buried and more oxygen built up, fires increased. These fires burned the very forests producing the carbon burial. A strange feedback loop, nature eating the hand that fed it. Eventually, something had to give. But not yet. For now, in this part of Earth's long breath, the fire and the forest existed in a kind of tense partnership. One fed the other, one ended the other. But both, together, shaped life. And what of the animals? It's easy to think of them as victims, tiny creatures scuttling through flames, darting from the heat. But many evolved to live with fire. Some insects laid their eggs in charred wood. Others timed their life cycles with regrowth phases. Amphibians used the cooling edges of burn zones as hunting grounds, where prey was exposed and still disoriented. Fossils show no great die-off from these fires alone. No mass extinction tied directly to combustion. Which tells us something remarkable. Life adapted to burn. Perhaps, in this strange high-oxygen world, fire wasn't an enemy at all. Perhaps it was simply another season. The rhythm of fire echoed deeper than roots. In some fossil layers, we find patterns. Layers of charcoal, followed by ferns, followed by bark again. Burn, bloom, build. The cycle repeats. It's tempting to think of this as destruction, but the evidence tells a subtler story. Fire wasn't just removing, it was selecting, curating, making space. We are not the first beings shaped by flame. The charcoal layers serve as a geological memory, a record of combustion, compressed and hidden beneath millions of years of pressure. These aren't the traces of small campfires. These are thick, dark seams that stretch for kilometers, embedded in ancient swamp deposits that would one day become the coal beneath our feet. How do we know they're fire remnants? Because of the presence of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, molecular fingerprints left behind when organic matter burns hot and fast. Because of the cellular structure of the preserved plant tissue, which shows the classic patterns of thermal degradation, and because there's simply too much inertinite in Carboniferous coals to be explained by anything else. This wasn't the rare exception. It was the rule. We picture forests as stable, green sanctuaries, but in this age they were dynamic theatres of ignition and rebirth. The land flickered. The skies responded. And life adjusted its tempo accordingly. Even the scale of the forest itself was unprecedented. These were not isolated woodlands. They were continent-spanning megabiomes, wet, equatorial belts of vegetation that stretched across what is now North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Back then, the continents were still colliding, forming a supercontinent we now call Pangaea. The collision pushed up mountains and lowered vast inland basins perfect for trapping water, heat, and plant life. The forests filled them, and the forests fed the flame. It's strange to think that what we now call fossil fuel, the coal that powers cities and warms homes, was once this. Not just ancient matter, but a living dance of atmosphere, fire, and evolution. A chemical surplus made possible by photosynthesis, and preserved, ironically, by the very fires that threatened it. Even stranger still is how this buried carbon shaped the future. That stored energy would be unlocked again, hundreds of millions of years later by us. Fire, once a natural cycle, would become a tool, a weapon, a promise, a danger. In that sense, the Carboniferous gave us more than fuel. It gave us the blueprint for combustion itself, and the seed of our eventual industrial firestorms. But the world would not stay this way forever. Oxygen levels, as we now know, do not remain fixed. They rise, they fall, they ripple across time, driven by shifting balances of burial, decay, weathering, and life. And while the Carboniferous saw the highest levels ever recorded, this peak was a moment, a breath held, a forest blazing at the height of its power. Soon, that breath would falter. Swamps would dry, seas would retreat, climate would shift, and the age of fire-fed giants would give way to something leaner, more enduring, less combustible. But, for a time, Earth was a fire-breathing forest, and every breeze held the power of ignition. What, then, remains of such a world? Only coal, only charcoal, only questions, and the quiet hum of oxygen in our lungs a reminder that we, too, live by fire. It's a chemical truth written into the breath of our cells, the spark of our neurons, and the slow-burning engines of our bodies. Oxygen is the match that never stops striking, and there was a time when that match flared brighter than we could ever imagine. So how does a planet come to inhale that deeply? The answer lies in a delicate, drawn-out transaction between the living and the buried. During the Carboniferous, plants had become master architects of atmosphere. They didn't just photosynthesize. They transformed sunlight into structure, wood, bark, leaf, root, and then left those structures behind in astonishing volumes. Normally, in a modern forest, that material would be broken down. Fungi, insects, bacteria, decomposition returns the carbon to the air as carbon dioxide, and the cycle continues. But in the swampy, stagnant basins of the Carboniferous world, this system broke down literally. Decomposition struggled to keep up. Low-lying wetlands were flooded often, turning forests into vast anoxic swamps. In these oxygen-poor zones, plant material resisted decay. Year after year, fallen trunks and mats of leaves pressed into thick peat beds. Over time, and we're talking millions of years, those peat beds were compressed into coal. But in the moment, they were acting as vaults that buried carbon and prevented it from returning to the sky. When you bury carbon, oxygen stays behind. That is the heart of it. For every molecule of carbon that didn't rot, one molecule of oxygen remained in the atmosphere. It accumulated. Slowly, then steadily. And the longer the forests grew and fell and were buried, the more oxygen the atmosphere gained. This is known as the oxygen overshoot of the late Carboniferous, and it wasn't subtle. While today's atmosphere contains about 21% oxygen, estimates for the Carboniferous range from 28 to 35%. That may not sound dramatic at first glance, but atmospheric chemistry does not follow a linear path. At 35% oxygen, the difference isn't a small boost. It's a fundamental shift in the behavior of fire, respiration, and life itself. We know this rise happened through several converging lines of evidence. One of the clearest comes from fossilized charcoal, as we saw in the last chapter. But researchers also look at the geochemical signatures in rocks ratios of sulfur and carbon isotopes that reflect global cycles of burial and oxidation. Sediment cores from ancient basins, the structure of fossil leaves and spores, even the growth rings of petrified plants offer hints about the air they once breathed. Taken together, the data builds a picture not just of elevated oxygen but of an atmosphere pushing the boundaries of what Earth has ever supported. Not before, not since. And once we understand that rise, the next question becomes inevitable. What is it like to breathe air that rich? Not everyone would survive the answer. To breathe 35% oxygen is not simply to breathe more. It is to invite the world inside at a faster rate, with greater potency, and with far less margin for error. In such air, a spark becomes a flame becomes a wall of fire, and a breath becomes a force. Let's begin with the human body, though. Of course, we did not exist in the Carboniferous. Still, we can model what 35% oxygen would do to lungs built like ours. In short, we would feel it immediately. The first breath would come easier, faster, deeper. Athletes today use hyperoxic chambers rooms with elevated oxygen levels for recovery. With 25% oxygen, muscle repair accelerates, fatigue drops, reaction times shorten. But by 30% and above, the benefit becomes less linear and more dangerous. Oxygen toxicity begins to whisper. In high concentrations, oxygen doesn't simply feed your cells, it starts to damage them. Free radicals multiply. Delicate tissues, like those in the lungs and eyes, begin to break down. Under pressure, like in deep-sea diving, this effect is even worse. Divers breathing pure oxygen at depth can suffer seizures, blindness, even death. The body is not designed for flame running through every vein. But we're not talking about pressurized chambers here. We're talking about open air, a planetary shift, a world where everything that breathed was breathing more. And in that world, not all organisms suffered. For insects and other arthropods, 35% oxygen was a gift. As we touched on before, These creatures don't inhale like mammals do. They rely on passive diffusion. Oxygen flows through spiracles, tiny holes in their exoskeleton, and travels along branching tubes. The higher the oxygen outside, the farther it travels inside, so the bigger the insect could grow. This is why we see Meganeura, with wings broader than a raven. This is why Arthropleura stretched longer than most human beds. The rules had changed. The air itself was enabling size. But it wasn't just about scale. High oxygen meant faster metabolism, more available energy. Insects could fly longer, move quicker, and recover faster. Their body plans didn't need to change. The environment did the work for them. It's possible that even early amphibians felt the boost. While many still relied on moist skin for some gas exchange, their developing lungs would have reaped the benefits. Deeper dives, louder calls, stronger leaps. Energy flowed more freely when the air held more of it. But what happens when energy flows too freely? That's where combustion comes in. Because oxygen is not only the currency of life, it is the key to fire. And with 35% in the atmosphere, Earth itself began to burn more easily. We tend to think of fire as an accident, a tragedy, but in this age it was almost a certainty, a kind of atmospheric reflex, an inevitable reply to heat and spark, and so the air burned. It didn't take much. A branch, brittle from a dry season, a rolling cloud overhead, a sudden bolt of lightning arcing across the canopy. In today's world, that might trigger a small fire. Local, containable, but in a world thick with oxygen, it was an invitation to a storm of flame. At 35% oxygen, combustion behaves differently. Fire doesn't just burn, it leaps. Ignition temperatures drop. Flame speeds increase. Materials that normally resist catching fire can suddenly go up in seconds. Even damp vegetation, the kind that would fizzle and smoke in today's forests, becomes flammable under the right conditions. Laboratory experiments have tried to replicate these effects. In controlled environments, researchers have burned plant matter in hyperoxic chambers simulating ancient atmospheric conditions. What they find is astonishing. Flames spread more quickly, reach higher temperatures, and consume fuel far more efficiently. The resulting heat columns are more intense. The fire becomes not just hotter, but more aggressive in its behavior. And this wasn't a rare occurrence in the Carboniferous. It was a feature of the landscape. Fire swept through the great swamp forests again and again, turning vast tracts of land into smoking fields. Not all at once, but often enough to leave a clear signature in the fossil record. The layers of inertinite, the fossilized charcoal we now mine in coal, testify to this recurring immolation. Each band tells a story of ignition, consumption, collapse, and rebirth. And here's where the feedback loop begins. The more oxygen in the air, the more likely fire becomes. The more fire, the more plant matter burns, but not all of it. The most intense fires can char material so quickly that it becomes resistant to decay. That carbon, locked in the form of charcoal, can then be buried like any other dead plant. And once again, oxygen is left behind. So fire-destructive, chaotic fire may have helped preserve the very atmospheric conditions that created it. This cycle of burial and combustion, of photosynthesis and flame, formed a kind of planetary metabolism, a breathing, burning rhythm that kept the Earth suspended in a high oxygen state. For millions of years, this dance continued. But there were other consequences, ones that reached into every corner of life. Every breath held more power. And not just for insects or amphibians, but for every single cell. Mitochondria, the energy factories of eukaryotic cells, run on oxygen. They turn it into adenosine triphosphate, the molecule that fuels nearly all cellular processes. With more oxygen available, more ATP can be made. Growth accelerates, healing quickens, activity becomes more sustained. But as with all systems pushed to extremes, balance begins to wobble. The same oxygen that empowers cells can also unravel them. Free radicals, the byproducts of oxygen metabolism, become more common in hyperoxic environments. These unstable molecules damage DNA, proteins, membranes. If not neutralized by antioxidants, they lead to cellular aging, disease, and dysfunction. Life, it seems, had to walk a line. Too little oxygen, and activity slows to a crawl. Too much, and the machinery of life overheats. So how did ancient organisms cope? Adaptation, as always, found a way. It may have been subtle at first, changes in enzyme efficiency, shifts in antioxidant defenses. But over time, species living in a hyperoxic world evolved strategies to survive its burn. Some cells ramped up production of enzymes like catalase and superoxide dismutase, crucial for neutralizing reactive oxygen species. Others altered the architecture of their tissues, shielding vulnerable systems from oxidative stress. These weren't conscious choices. They were the slow accumulations of advantage, tiny molecular edits that tipped survival in one direction instead of another. We see hints of these changes in the fossil record. In the internal canal systems of giant arthropods, in the proportions of their spiracle openings, in the structure of amphibian skin and lungs, there's no single fossil that says, here is the moment oxygen became too much. But there are clues, echoes of physiology adapting to invisible pressure. And of course, not every lineage made it. Some may have burned out, quite literally overheated by metabolic rates that pushed too far. Others may have fallen victim to the very fires that reshaped their habitats. Oxygen giveth, and oxygen taketh away. This raises a deeper question. Was 35% oxygen ever sustainable? Many scientists believe the high oxygen world of the late Carboniferous was inherently unstable, a consequence of unique geological and biological conditions that couldn't last forever. The vast coal swamps that drove the burial of carbon began to change. As continents shifted and climates dried, these wetlands receded. With fewer plants being buried, less carbon was locked away. And when carbon isn't buried, it's released. Oxygen levels begin to fall. There's evidence for this transition in the form of shifting coal deposits. After the Carboniferous, inertinite-rich layers become rarer, charcoal diminishes. Fern spores are replaced by drought-tolerant seed ferns and early conifers. The planet was drying out. The fires still came, but the oxygen that had once fed them began to retreat, and with it, the giants. As oxygen declined, the upper limits on insect size fell. By the Permian period, we see a sharp reduction in the size of winged insects. No more meter-long millipedes. No dragonflies with dinnerplate wings. The environment had changed. The air no longer carried them. This wasn't extinction in the dramatic sense. It was compression, a quiet deflation of what had once been possible. But before the fall, there was a peak, a narrow band in Earth's history when the sky itself was supercharged. When every flame reached higher, when every breath held a deeper spark. It's a humbling thought that the invisible gas we take for granted today was once the architect of giants, the ally of fire, the quiet sculptor of ecosystems. And yet, it's also a warning, because oxygen doesn't just reflect biology, it responds to it. So what happens when a planet exhales too much, or not enough? Fluctuations in oxygen are not just ancient curiosities, they are planetary memories written in stone, coal, and air. And they continue to echo, shaping not only the history of life, but its boundaries. When oxygen rose to its peak during the late Carboniferous, life danced closer to both brilliance and danger. Every living thing breathed faster, burned hotter, grew larger. Fire became part of the landscape's metabolism. Evolution ran wild, chasing opportunity with reckless intensity. But the same conditions that enabled life to thrive also made the system fragile. This fragility is part of a wider concept in earth science: feedback loops. During the Carboniferous, oxygen-rich air made fires more likely. Fires, in turn, helped sequester more carbon by forming charcoal that resisted decay. More burial meant more oxygen. And so the loop continued until something broke it. That something was climate. Tectonic shifts changed the shape of the continents. Mountain building altered rainfall patterns. Swamps that once sprawled across equatorial regions began to fragment. Peatlands dried out. As the great coal forests shrank, so too did the planet's capacity to bury carbon. Once carbon stayed above ground, microbes returned to their work. Decomposition picked up again. Carbon dioxide levels began to rise. Oxygen levels declined. And with that drop, the giants disappeared. Physiologically, this meant new pressures on life. For insects, the diffusion of oxygen through tracheae became less efficient. The upper size limit fell. Winged predators grew smaller, their dominance curtailed. Amphibians struggled as drier climates favored tougher, more water-efficient reptiles. It wasn't a mass extinction. It was a quiet transformation. The world contracted. But the lessons of that expansion remain. We now understand that oxygen, something so basic, so constant to our lives, is anything but stable across geological time. It rises and falls in response to the choices life makes. How it grows, how it dies, and how it decomposes. Today, we live in the aftermath of that story. A planet breathing in cycles. A world where oxygen still hovers around 21%. Not too little, not too much. Just enough to fuel our cells, light our fires, and carry our voices across the air. But we now have the power to shift it again. Deforestation, fossil fuel combustion, soil disruption, all of these impact the fine balance between carbon burial and carbon release. And unlike the Carboniferous, the changes today are fast, compressed, human-shaped. The rhythms that once took millions of years now unfold across decades. Even the oceans, once oxygen-rich nurseries, now show signs of stress zones of depletion, breathless waters. Even coral reefs, ancient cradles of biodiversity, are gasping beneath warming seas and shifting chemistry. Their decline is not only a tragedy of beauty, but a signal, a quiet exhale from ecosystems stretched beyond resilience. If the Carboniferous was a time of unintentional atmospheric transformation, today's changes are anything but accidental. That ancient forest, with its glowing air and fire-fed giants, is not just a memory. It is a reminder, a warning, a question. How much oxygen is enough? And what happens when the breath of a planet starts to change once more? Whatever the answer, it will not come all at once. It will arrive in quiet layers, in fires that burn longer, in creatures that grow smaller, in air that feels just a little thinner. And we, like those ancient insects, will either adapt or disappear. Adaptation, after all, is a kind of wager. Life looks at the conditions it's been given and makes a risky bet on size, on shape, on strategy. And, for a brief span in deep time, the bet was on bigness. The kind of bigness that defies modern expectation, not in the form of towering dinosaurs or swimming reptiles, but in the hum of wings, the scrape of armored legs, the soft thunder of something crawling just out of view. This was the age of giant arthropods. Imagine walking the forest floor of the late Carboniferous, surrounded by the low hiss of swamp gas and the slow drip of condensation falling from tree-sized ferns. You pause beneath a club moss 2 stories tall and suddenly a shadow flickers overhead. Not a bird. Birds do not yet exist. This is Meganeura, a dragonfly the size of a crow, wingspan stretching over 2.5 feet across. The air vibrates with its passage. Its compound eyes flash as it scans for prey. Now look down. The leaf litter beneath your feet shivers, not with the movement of mice or lizards, but something else, something longer, heavier. A ripple of black plates undulates across the path. Arthropleura, a millipede that can stretch more than 8 feet long. It doesn't scuttle. It shifts. Each leg rises and falls in coordinated waves. Its back glistens with moisture. This is not an anomaly. This is the shape life took when oxygen allowed it. There was no magic in their size, No trick of genetics or sudden mutation. What made these creatures possible was chemistry. Specifically, the chemistry of the air around them. At 30 to 35% atmospheric oxygen, everything that crawled, breathed, or fluttered through the air did so with more fuel. But for arthropods, the relationship is more direct. Unlike vertebrates, they do not inhale air into lungs. They don't have blood rich with hemoglobin. Instead, they rely on a network of thin, branching tubes, tracheae, that connect the outside world directly to their internal tissues. Oxygen diffuses through these tubes passively. No muscles pump it. No cells carry it. The gas moves along a gradient from where it is more concentrated to where it is less. The problem is, diffusion is a slow process. It works well over short distances but breaks down over longer ones. That's why insects today are small. The air can only reach so far. If you double an insect's body size, the volume of tissue it must oxygenate increases far faster than the surface area through which oxygen enters. But in the Carboniferous, this limitation was relaxed. With more oxygen outside the body, diffusion could reach farther, faster, and with greater effect. The rules had shifted. The atmosphere itself became a kind of exoskeleton support system. It didn't just permit giant insects, it enabled them. And through the fossil record, these giants still whisper. Whispers, of course, take many forms in paleontology. Sometimes they arrive as wings pressed flat into ancient stone, delicate, paper-thin membranes fossilized by luck and time. Other times, they are the deep grooves of a trackway, etched into once soft mud that hardened beneath layers of sediment. These are not skeletons, not bones, but they are evidence all the same. Ghost signatures, written by creatures that once soared or crawled across the Carboniferous landscape. Let's start with the wings. The most iconic is Meganeura monyi, discovered in France in the late 19th century. Its wingspan, measured from fossil impressions, exceeds 65 centimeters larger than many modern birds. Its venation pattern, the layout of veins through the wings, is almost identical to that of modern dragonflies. And that's the strangest part. It wasn't wildly different, it didn't reinvent flight. It simply scaled it up. What changed wasn't the design. It was the air. Thicker with oxygen, the atmosphere allowed greater lift. Aerodynamic drag changed. Wing loading dropped. Muscles contracted faster, with more power. The very physics of flight were altered. And the result was a predator that could glide silently above the forest floor, scan with multifaceted eyes, and snatch prey mid-air with needle-like legs. But Meganeura was just one piece of the picture. On the ground, Arthropleura left its own legacy not in bones, which do not fossilize in exoskeletons, but in the vast trackways it carved through the mud. Some of these trackways have been found in Scotland and the northeastern United States. They stretch for meters, with paired impressions like tank treads, flanking a central drag mark. At first glance, they might be mistaken for the tracks of a cart or the grooves left by ancient machinery. But there was no machinery then. Only movement. The movement of a body made from over 30 segments, each one bearing legs that rose and fell in synchrony, grinding into wet sediment. And these were not subtle prints. Some trackways are over 50 centimeters wide. They suggest a body nearly a meter across, moving with purposeful force. We don't know what Arthropleura ate, perhaps detritus, perhaps small prey, but we know it moved, and that movement was heavy. The impressions tell us more than size. They tell us about gait, about terrain, about how weight was distributed. From these grooves, researchers can model limb spacing, walking speed, even the texture of the forest floor. Each fossil, each print, is a forensic clue, not a headline, a whisper. Together, they reveal a world where scale was different, where the simple act of crawling left a scar in stone, where the air's generosity allowed creatures to stretch beyond today's expectations. And for a while, nothing held them back. Not predators, not pressure, not gravity. Only time would shrink them. Time, after all, has its own kind of gravity, and though the high oxygen window lasted millions of years, it was still a window, open just wide enough for giants to slip through, then quietly close. But before that slow contraction, these arthropods dominated their domains. They filled ecological roles we wouldn't expect of creatures so alien to us. Not just prey, not just scavengers, some were hunters. Some were keystone species in systems we can barely reconstruct. Take Meganeura, for instance. Its mouthparts were sharp, serrated, built not for chewing leaves, but for piercing flesh. It likely fed on other insects, flying beetles, juvenile amphibians, perhaps even early vertebrates small enough to grasp. Its hunting style may have mirrored modern hawks, soaring in silence, scanning from above, striking with sudden violence. But where a hawk uses feathers and bone, Meganeura used chitin and instinct, and it wasn't alone in the sky. There were others. Giant mayflies, massive lacewings. Each evolved to fill a particular aerial niche. The diversity wasn't just in size. It was in form, in strategy, in competition. The Carboniferous sky was not empty. It buzzed. It flickered. It hunted. And below, in the damp and steaming underworld of the forest floor, Arthropleura moved like a machine. Though we don't have its internal organs, its size tells us it must have had highly efficient respiration for its time, likely aided by thin body walls and the shallow diffusion of oxygen across its tissues. Its armored body was more than defense, it was a structural necessity. Exoskeletons become a burden as size increases. Without the buoyancy of water, gravity is relentless. But the high oxygen of the time may have made muscle contractions more powerful, allowing these enormous millipedes to move despite their mass. And yet, for all their size, there's something strangely fragile about their world. No hard skulls, no fossilized hearts, no fossilized thoughts. Most of what we know comes from absence, from the shapes pressed into stone, from the paths left behind. We do not know what color Meganeura's wings were. We do not know how Arthropleura moved when it climbed. We can't hear the sound its legs made on soft soil, but we do know it existed, because the world allowed it. Because oxygen flowed freely enough to carry its form. It's important to understand that none of this could happen today. Insects cannot grow to such sizes under current atmospheric conditions. The math doesn't work. The diffusion gradient is too weak. The respiratory system fails before the body can mature. That ceiling is locked in place unless the atmosphere shifts again. And while we often romanticize dinosaurs as nature's giants, it was the arthropods that got there first. With no spine, no skull, no voice, just wings like sails and jaws like blades. Blade-like jaws weren't built for intimidation, they were built for work, to pierce, shear, grasp, and hold. Meganeura's mandibles likely moved in sideways motions, slicing through the soft bodies of prey in mid-flight. Unlike vertebrate predators, it had no teeth, no tongue. Only mechanical efficiency, a mouth adapted to open in silence and close with finality. This is what high oxygen enabled. Not just size, but complexity at size. Tissues that demanded more energy could be supported. Muscles could be denser, faster. Reactions could occur with greater intensity. In a world where the very air was more combustible, so too were the bodies shaped within it, and the forests were ready for them. We often imagine ancient forests as empty places, quiet, peaceful. But if you were there, the air would not have been still. It would have hummed with life, with buzzing, flapping, crawling motion. Many arthropods weren't solitary. Fossils suggest bursts of seasonal emergence, mayflies, and other winged insects rising in synchrony from shallow water, swarming like glitter under diffuse sunlight. To predators like Meganeura, these were aerial feasts. To amphibians below, they were falling manna. Everything fed on everything else. The energy budget of the forest was high, and that energy moved through insects, not mammals, not birds. In many ways, insects were the vertebrates of their age, dominating the air, filling diverse roles, defining ecosystems. And the predators weren't alone in this aerial ballet. Each emergence event would have changed the sound of the forest, a low hum swelling into thunder, wingbeats layered over wingbeats, like rain tapping on stretched skin. Moments when the forest floor dimmed beneath the cloud of life above. This period also gave rise to the first true predatory terrestrial food webs. Arthropods, feeding on other arthropods, amphibians, snapping at bugs the size of birds. The violence wasn't grotesque, it was ordinary. A rhythm. Just as fire had become a season, predation had become structure. And still, for all their dominance, the giants had limits. Size was not a free gift. It came with trade-offs. Large insects had slower maturation times. They were more vulnerable to habitat disruption. Their molting process, essential for growing through rigid exoskeletons, was fraught with risk. A poor molt meant deformity or death. With greater size came greater dependence on stable, wet environments. The very swamps that fed them could also entomb them, and when the climate shifted, they had nowhere to go. Oxygen began to decline. Swamps drained. Competition changed. Predators with new advantages emerged: early reptiles, better suited to drier lands. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, the rules were rewritten once more, but in the layers they left behind, the giants left their signatures: trackways in ancient stone, wings flattened into shale, mandibles curled into silence. Each a fingerprint of a world that once gave arthropods the sky. A sky filled not with birdsong, but the dry, rhythmic clatter of chitin on wind. For now, we study their traces. We hold them to the light, measure them in microns, and try to listen. Because every fossil speaks not just of a creature, but of the air that shaped it. We listen because these fossils do not just record bodies, they record possibilities. In a world charged with oxygen, life pressed its boundaries outward. Not with bones and brains, but with shells and segments, with eyes that saw in fragments, with legs that moved in waves. The giants of the Carboniferous remind us that evolution is not always a march toward mammals. Sometimes it is a bloom in an entirely different direction. Their dominance was not a fluke, it was not a mistake. It was a response to the world they inherited. And then, just as quietly, they began to shrink. As the atmosphere shifted, the physical rules changed. The oxygen gradient weakened. The diffusion window closed. Body plans that had thrived for millions of years suddenly faced invisible resistance. They couldn't breathe as efficiently. They couldn't molt without flaw. They became too big for the world that followed. What was once their greatest advantage size became a burden, and so, gradually they faded. Not all at once, not in catastrophe, but like a tide going out. We see this in the fossil record not as a crash, but as a soft transition. Smaller wings, narrower tracks, shorter segments, the echoes of a retreat. The world did not forget them overnight. It carried their outlines forward, etched in sediment, preserved by time. And still, they visit us. In the iridescence of a dragonfly's wing, in the glint of beetle armor, in the strange multi-legged scurry across the floor of a damp forest. Their descendants are small now, but the architecture remains. Their legacy lives in miniature. So what do we learn from these creatures? That life responds to air. That size is not only about genetics, it is about the medium in which life breathes. That evolution is not linear, but opportunistic. It reaches in all directions, shaped not only by competition or intelligence, but by atmosphere, chemistry, and chance. Insects the size of hawks, millipedes as long as cars, a world where chitin ruled the skies. They remind us that our planet has hosted more than one kind of greatness, and that the giants of the past did not roar, they buzzed. They hovered, they crawled, they fed, they burned. They told a story with their wings and their jaws, a story of atmosphere and opportunity. of biological ambition made briefly possible by a surplus of breath. We measure their tracks now like archaeologists of oxygen, piecing together how the world once felt when air was thick, when fire was fast, and when the sky belonged to something altogether different. Not birds, not planes, but insects living wind machines powered by air that was richer, stranger, and more flammable than our own. And when we breathe in, we still inhale their past, because inside every lungful of air there lingers a memory, not of a creature, but of a condition, a world where breath was abundance, and the smallest life forms dared to dream large. And if we listen closely to the silence between wing beats today, we might still hear a trace of that ambition buzzing, waiting, reminding us of the air that once made giants. They were not warm-blooded, not loud, not clever in the ways we measure cleverness, but they were bold. Their bodies told the story of a planet that gave too much just long enough for the impossible to grow legs and lift into the sky. And somewhere, beneath forest leaf and ripple-shadowed stream, the blueprint waits quiet, intact, and watching, waiting, perhaps, for the air to change again, for chemistry to whisper yes, for silence to become movement once more. The air shaped them, but it was the swamp that held them. Beneath the buzzing canopies and chitinous wings, life thickened into something stranger. Sunlight trickled down through layers of fern-frond shadows, diffused into humid twilight where breath felt heavier and every surface gleamed with moisture. This was the underworld of the Carboniferous forest, the coal swamp. To step into it would feel like wading into lungs. The ground was not solid. It pulsed, slowly sinking beneath your weight. Mats of moss and lycopod roots tangled beneath still water. Decay clung to the air, sweet and sharp. Every inch of ground was alive, and not all of it friendly. Here, among the stagnant pools and shallow floodplains, the story of vertebrate rise truly begins. It wasn't glamorous. The creatures that ruled this world did not roar. They lurked. They blinked sideways. They moved when it was safe to move. Amphibians, some as small as your palm, others as long as your leg, were the undisputed masters of the murk. And there were many of them. The biodiversity of the coal swamps is staggering, even by modern standards. Fossils reveal a panoply of forms. Salamander, like predators with broad heads and tooth. Lined jaws. Eel-bodied swimmers with reduced limbs. Squat walkers with barrel torsos and paddle-like tails. Some were highly aquatic, others semi-terrestrial. They filled every available ecological niche: ambush hunters, scavengers, insectivores, even cannibals. These were not modern frogs. They were labyrinthodonts, colostides, temnospondyls. Their names sound like spells, and in a way, they are. Spells cast from old bones to conjure up forgotten worlds. What gave them such an advantage here was partly timing, and partly terrain. The coal swamps were ideal for amphibians. Warm, wet, rich in cover and prey. Amphibians breathe partly through their skin, which must remain moist. In this environment they never dried out. Water was everywhere: ponds, seasonal pools, rain-choked depressions, flooded root systems, and their prey was abundant. Insects, worms, smaller amphibians, even the occasional fish trapped in an oxygen-starved pool. The coal swamp was a buffet, and amphibians were the ones holding the plates. But it wasn't just about food. It was also about shelter. The root systems of giant lycopods like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria formed dense cages beneath the surface, tangled, vertical tubes as thick as human thighs. Some of these became natural burrows. Others served as hiding spots, ambush points, or egg-laying chambers. When a predator swam too close, something could shoot out from the darkness, jaws open, then vanish again without a sound. It was here, in this wet cathedral of decay, that vertebrates began to experiment, with movement, with sound, with breath. Not yet land dwellers, but thinking about it. Not yet dominant, but no longer at the mercy of the invertebrate world above. To crawl through such a world was to make 1,000 decisions a day: when to surface, where to feed, how to disappear. Evolution in these swamps became a negotiation, and slowly, through countless iterations, amphibians began to solve the riddle of land, not by abandoning water, but by learning how to leave it and return. Their bodies told the story. Fossils show limbs with stronger girdles, bones bracing against gravity, rather than drifting passively in water. Their skulls became flatter, wider, better suited for side-slung ambush. The eyes crept upward, peaking just above the surface. The neck, once fused in early fish ancestors, began to unbolt itself vertebra by vertebra until the head could pivot freely, independent from the shoulders. This was not yet the age of reptiles, not yet dry skin and hard-shelled eggs, but it was a rehearsal. The coal swamps became evolutionary theatres, staging quiet performances in the dark. Here, an amphibian developed toes strong enough to paddle through muck without sinking. There, another grew a wider mouth, able to snap sideways and catch faster prey. Every adaptation was an answer to this environment's questions. How do you hunt in thick root mazes? How do you breathe when the water smells like rot? How do you lay your eggs where they won't be eaten before dawn? Amphibians weren't uniform. They were a spectrum. Some, like Carboniferous, had long, eel-like bodies and reduced limbs, slipping through weed-choked streams like shadows. Others, like Eriops, had massive heads and wide, squat bodies, stomping across shallow water with the confidence of apex predators. Some species, like Reptile, lived between worlds. Neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial, they were amphibious in the truest sense, belonging to both realms, but master of neither. They didn't need to be, because in these swamps, the water did most of the work. It carried sound, it hid movement, it buffered temperature, it cradled the young. And when the dry season came, the amphibians retreated underground into the hollow roots of lycopods, into decaying logs, into burrows carved with webbed feet. Some may have entered torpor. Others laid gelatinous eggs in moist soil, betting on the rains to return. These were creatures of threshold, half in, half out. And in those threshold spaces, something extraordinary began to unfold. Lungs, no longer just backup systems, became primary. Limbs, once vestigial paddles, took on new roles supporting the body, shifting its weight, pushing against gravity. Each step onto soft peat was a rehearsal for something that hadn't happened yet. The future was forming in the shadows, vertebrates learning to rise. And all around them, the swamp held its breath. The surface, still as glass, mirrored trees that were not truly trees: giant club mosses, horsetails, seed ferns. Their trunks were hollow, their leaves spined and stiff. From above, the canopy looked like a jungle. From within, it was more like scaffolding. Vines wrapped around stems that bent rather than broke. Roots pierced waterlogged ground, holding nothing in place. And beneath it all, decay. Layer upon layer of fallen fronds, bark, and spore casings gathered at the base of the forest. They didn't rot the way they would today. Fungi had not yet fully evolved the enzymes to break down lignin, the tough material that gives wood its strength. So instead of disappearing, dead plant matter accumulated. It piled up in matted, fibrous carpets. In every rain basin, every forest hollow, this was peat, and peat, over time, under pressure, under heat, becomes coal. This is where coal comes from, not from dinosaurs, as the myth goes, but from this silent green prison, from swamps that never drained, from roots that never dried, from life that died and refused to vanish. Coal is not a rock. It is time, compressed. We mine it now in layers in ribbons of carbon black that trace the outlines of vanished forests. We find fossilized root systems called stigmaria, preserved in place, spiraling outward in petrified soil. We find lepidodendron trunks flattened like scrolls, their diamond-patterned bark etched into stone like the scales of some forgotten beast. And between these layers, the ghosts. Impressions of amphibian bones, ripple marks from shallow water, charcoal lines from ancient fires, a stratigraphy of life and breath. Entombed and reordered by sediment, it is in these deposits that we begin to read the larger story. Because the coal swamps didn't just cradle amphibians, they preserved their world. They sealed it beneath layers of mineral-rich mud, holding onto it long enough for us to find it, hundreds of millions of years later. The climate, the vegetation, even the rhythm of the seasons can be inferred from these layers. Pollen grains, trapped in silt, spores, fossilized mid-burst. The arrangement of tree roots tells us where water once pooled. The thickness of peat beds tells us how long forests stood undisturbed. Even the spacing between inertinite bands, fossilized charcoal, offers clues about the frequency of fires. And this matters, because the coal swamps were not just backdrops for evolution, they were engines, climate regulators, carbon sinks, storytellers. Without them, there would be no coal. Without coal, no industrial age. And without the creatures who lived and died there, no vertebrate legacy, no lungs, no footsteps, no us. To understand just how powerful these swamps were, you have to think in layers not only of soil and sediment, but of time, pressure, and breath. Every footstep in that world pressed organic matter deeper into the muck. Every fallen branch, every sunken frond, every dead amphibian body was one more layer waiting to be buried. The swamp was both cradle and crypt. It fed life, then wrapped it in silence. And the weight of that silence was immense. Over millions of years, as more sediment accumulated, the heat and pressure transformed peat into lignite, then into bituminous coal, and eventually into anthracite, the hardest, most carbon-rich form of all. What began as the loose, fibrous detritus of a forest became something dense, black, and combustible. Energy, locked away. And that energy wasn't abstract. It was biological. It was photosynthesis, frozen in time. Every lump of coal you've ever seen is sunlight captured by Carboniferous plants, layered by swamp cycles, and buried deep enough to be forgotten. Burn it, and that light returns in a different form. Heat, flame, motion, the steam engines of the 19th century. The power grids of the 20th, our earliest cities, our wars, our modern world, all of it built, in some way, on the back of those swamps. But the irony is cruel, because the burning of coal doesn't just return light, it returns carbon. Carbon that had been trapped, locked beneath Earth's surface for over 300 million years. As we release it back into the atmosphere, we alter the climate once again, only this time, not through slow tectonic shifts or plant evolution, but by our own hand. We are unsealing the breath of the Carboniferous. And the world notices. In that ancient time, carbon burial pulled carbon dioxide levels down. Oxygen rose, fire spread, life surged, the climate cooled, then stabilized. Feedback loops danced in balance. Now, we're reversing that pattern in centuries instead of epochs. But beyond its legacy in coal, the swamp left us something else, something quieter. It gave us structure. The coal forest is where vertebrate blueprints were stress-tested, where the earliest limbs faced uneven terrain, where lungs met fluctuating humidity, where eyes learned to peer through haze, and ears began to pick up the splash of distant prey. Without these swamps, vertebrate life may never have made the leap, not just onto land, but into dominance. The bones we dig from the black mud aren't heroic. They're awkward, flattened, sometimes barely distinguishable from twigs. But they speak. They tell us this was where vertebrates failed and tried again, grew stronger, learned to carry their own weight, learned to time their movements with rainfall, learned to trust breath, not water. And maybe most important of all, they learned to wait, to hide in silence, to endure until the next flood, until the canopy opened, until the forest shifted enough for something new to emerge from the stillness. Some of these creatures may have lived for years in the same pool, unseen. Their footprints washed away, their bodies soft, unlikely to fossilize, and yet, in the rare moments when they were buried just right, their presence crossed millions of years to reach us. Before the dinosaurs, before mammals, before feathers, claws, or fur, there was the swamp. And the slow decision to rise. To rise from the swamp was not a conquest. It was a negotiation. Every vertebrate that crept forward onto land carried the weight of the water behind it, the legacy of gills, the softness of eggs, the skin that still whispered for rain. These early pioneers were not built for speed. They were built for survival, for compromise. And they emerged not onto dry plains, but into tangled margins, mudflats, riverbanks, fern forests choked with shadows. The world beyond the swamp was unfamiliar, unpredictable. It offered both promise and peril. Food, if you could catch it. Air, if your lungs were strong enough, but also drought, and Sunday, and predators that no longer moved in water, but crouched above it. Yet something drove vertebrates to try. The fossil record shows bursts of experimentation. Limb proportions changed. Rib cages expanded to hold more air. Some skulls developed stronger jaw muscles for crushing insects. Others evolved hinged joints to snap shut faster. These weren't linear improvements, they were scattered, messy attempts at something new, prototypes rather than plans. Each form was a gamble placed in the dark, and the swamp preserved them all. What makes the Carboniferous coal swamps so extraordinary is not just what they grew, but what they recorded. The conditions of these wetlands, low oxygen in sediment, rapid burial, high acidity, meant that things which would normally rot away had a chance to last. Imprints of soft-bodied creatures, skin textures, trackways from animals dragging their bellies across the mud, even coprolites, fossilized droppings offering insight into ancient diets. It's a kind of time capsule, but one formed not by design, but by water, weight, and time, one that remembers more than bones. And what we find inside that capsule is not a triumphant ascent, but a slow unfolding. Vertebrates didn't charge onto land with fanfare. They crept, they faltered, they waited for rain, they returned to the water when needed. And in doing so, they learned how to carry a watery past into a drier future. We often celebrate the leap to land as a kind of evolutionary graduation, but it was more like a balancing act between breath and water, risk and shelter. The coal swamps were the training grounds, the proving grounds, the in-between, and then, eventually, they disappeared. Climate shifted, the continents moved, the swamps dried, coal stopped forming, oxygen levels fell. The giants, arthropods, amphibians gave way to something else. Reptiles began to rise, skin thickened, eggs hardened, movement changed. But the memory of the swamp lived on in the architecture of vertebrate life, in the way lungs pull air, in the articulation of wrists and ankles, in the instinct to seek shelter beneath root and rock, in the rhythm of breath. Even now, there are echoes, in salamanders that still wriggle between submerged roots, in frogs that carry their young in their mouths, in mudskippers straddling the line between water and sky, propped up on fins that almost became feet, in our embryonic development itself, which passes through stages that recall our amphibious ancestry, gill-like arches, tails, the watery environment of the womb. The swamp is still inside us, in our need to return to water, to bathe, to float, to soak wounds and silence thought, in dreams that take place in flooded cities, in childhood memories of rain, in the way grief sounds when spoken in a whisper. We don't just remember the swamp, we feel it. When we look back, we look through coal, through flattened forests and waterlogged bones, and what we see, in those black mirrors of time, is not just a world that once was. We see the echo of emergence, the flicker of vertebrate ambition forming not in triumph, but in mud. We see that every future has its roots in something soft, that even the most towering of creatures once clung to water, flinched from sun, and huddled in silence beneath moss-draped logs, before speed, before strength, before conquest, there was the swamp, and the slow, patient decision to rise. But rising was never just about movement. It was about risk, about stepping into a world with fewer answers and far more variables. So what happens when water is no longer enough? It begins with something so small you could crush it underfoot without ever knowing what you erased. An egg. Not just any egg, but a sealed, self-contained world. A future embryo, protected from drying winds and predators. An egg that could survive far from water. And that, according to the clues we've found in the dark, was the gamble. The amniotic egg. Today, we take it for granted. Every bird's nest, every lizard's clutch, every snake coiled around its offspring all descend from that innovation. A leap forward so quiet, it made no sound in its first moments, but it changed everything. It was biology's first true passport to dry land. Inside that leathery shell was a self-contained ecosystem, a fluid-filled amnion to cushion the embryo, a yolk sac for nourishment, a chorion for gas exchange, and an allantois to handle waste. 4 membranes, 1 idea. Survive without returning to the swamp. But why did it evolve? We can only guess at the pressures. Perhaps flash floods were drowning soft, jelly-like amphibian eggs. Perhaps predators were feasting on unprotected spawn. Perhaps the swamp itself was shrinking, becoming patchy, unpredictable. In that world, anything that could breed on land had an advantage. It's difficult to overstate how revolutionary that was, because for hundreds of millions of years, vertebrates had been shackled to water. Their reproduction depended on it. Their eggs needed to float, to soak, to breathe through thin membranes. But with the amniotic egg, the leash was severed. And with that came a second change. Skin. Amphibians breathe partially through their skin. It must remain moist, permeable. But as the egg moved to land, so too did the body. The skin of the first reptiles grew thicker, drier, more resistant to the elements. Scales formed small keratin shields against abrasion, dehydration, and ultraviolet light. The first true reptiles weren't monsters. They weren't large. They weren't fast. But they were survivors. Tiny creatures, likely no larger than a human hand, darting through leaf litter and sunlit roots. Hylonomus, we believe, was one of them. Fossils of this early reptile were found in tree stumps, hollowed trunks from the Carboniferous forests, long since petrified. Some scientists believe they were trapped there after falling in. Others think they sought shelter from predators or heat. But whatever brought them there, the fossils remained. And they tell us something important. Reptiles didn't explode onto the scene. They tiptoed. They emerged into niches. The amphibians couldn't reach drier slopes, sandy plains, forest margins. They weren't dominant. They were adaptable. They weren't dramatic. They were deliberate. And the fossil record, when read like a diary written in stone, shows this slow transition from soft skin to scales, from external fertilization to internal, from swamp-bound spawn to sealed universes laid in sand, from swamp-bound spawn to sealed universes laid in sand. It wasn't a revolution made of thunder. It was a shift in silence. Amphibians had ruled the wetlands. Their bodies were suited for it: broad, flat skulls to rest low in water, limbs that pushed gently through mud, and skin that could breathe while submerged. But step too far from the bank, and their kingdom failed them. Their eggs would shrivel, their lungs would pant, their skin would crack. They were powerful within their element, but the element was changing. During the late Carboniferous and early Permian, Earth's climate began to dry. Vast rainforests fragmented. Coastal swamps contracted. Where once there were endless wetlands, now came seasonal droughts, shifting rivers, and expanding arid zones. To an amphibian, that was a death sentence. To a reptile, it was opportunity. With sealed eggs and sealed skin, the first reptiles weren't explorers, they were opportunists. They moved not with bravado, but with quiet confidence into dry hollows. sunlit forest floors, and upland ridges where amphibians could not follow. They didn't just survive, they multiplied. Reptiles could exploit new food sources, insects, fallen fruit, carrion. They didn't need to return to water to reproduce. Their range expanded, and with that range came divergence. Some remained small and quick. Others grew longer bodies, better for wriggling between roots or pushing through leaf litter. Still others began to bulk up, experiment with posture. Hints of future predators. Hints of future grazers. The seeds of all later lineages, from lizards to crocodiles to dinosaurs, were being quietly planted. But transition always comes with overlap, and in these ancient habitats, amphibians and reptiles coexisted. For a time, West Lothiana is one such clue. A fossil found in Scotland, preserved in a fine-grained sediment bed that once sat at the edge of a shrinking lagoon. It looks like a lizard, but it isn't quite. Somewhere between amphibian and reptile, it represents that evolutionary liminal space, a blurred edge, not a clean divide. And it reminds us, nature doesn't draw hard lines. It scribbles. It experiments. It tries 1,000 forms, discards most, and keeps a few. This was the gamble. Not just to create something new, but to keep enough of the old to survive. Because even as reptiles rose, they inherited what had worked. 4 limbs, lungs, vertebrae, eyes suited for air. Every breakthrough was layered on top of ancient scaffolding. Organisms aren't built from scratch. They're edited. And each edit cost something. The dry skin of a reptile meant less ability to breathe through it. The amniotic egg meant a higher investment per offspring. A new strategy of care, or at least calculation. Lay fewer eggs, but protect them. Hatchlings that emerged fully formed, not as tadpoles. Lives that were immediately terrestrial, and lives that could keep going when the rains failed. In that fading humidity, in that fractured forest light, something had shifted. This wasn't the age of reptiles. Not yet. But it was the moment they stopped needing to ask the water for permission. And that single shift, quiet, internal genetic set reptiles on a new trajectory. Freedom from water wasn't just a biological advantage, it was a spatial one. It meant the world got bigger. It meant no more being confined to the rim of every lake, the edge of every stream. A reptile could carry its survival kit inside its body. Oxygen in lungs, water in blood, a developing embryo wrapped in membranes. Evolution had issued them a passport, and the world they inherited was not a gentle one. The Earth's interior was changing. Pangaea, the great supercontinent, was beginning to stitch itself together. Continental collisions raised mountain ranges, fractured coastlines, and shifted climates. As tropical wetlands dried, uplands spread. The environment was becoming more extreme. Hotter days, colder nights, longer droughts. Reptiles had a body plan that could keep up. Stronger limbs, tougher skin, better water retention, lungs better adapted for dry air. Unlike amphibians, whose gas exchange partly depended on exposed skin, reptiles were fully air-breathing, internalizing every risk, every breath. And that came with power. They could go where others couldn't, climb further, hunt longer, bury themselves deeper in sand or leaf litter. Their physiology didn't just permit expansion, it encouraged it. We see this in the fossil record, not through size or spectacle, but through spread. The distribution of early reptile fossils grows wider. We find them in upland deposits, in once arid basins, in sediment far from permanent water sources. This is how we know they had broken free. Hylonomus, again, provides a beautiful forensic clue. Its fossils found in the hollow stumps of lycopod trees were once thought to be accidental, traps, but some researchers believe they may have been used intentionally as shelter, nesting sites, or ambush points. If true, this would mean not just survival in drier conditions, but behavioral complexity. A reptile using the architecture of its world strategically, not passively, and there were others, Paleothyrus, Captorhinus, Tiny, sharp-toothed creatures that probably hunted insects and smaller vertebrates. They moved fast, thought fast, breathed fully through internal lungs. Some had enlarged jaw muscles, others had overlapping rows of teeth. These were not just survivors, they were adapters, tinkered prototypes of things to come. But even as reptiles spread, amphibians didn't vanish. For millions of years, both groups coexisted like cousins taking different roads out of the same old town. Amphibians remained near water. Some grew massive, like Eriops, an early temnospondyle predator, its wide mouth and robust limbs perfect for ambushing prey in slow-moving rivers. Yet the rules had changed. Reptiles didn't need the same invitation to thrive. Their strategy was slower but surer, less reliant on boom cycles, less vulnerable to crash, and the world, its tectonics, its skies, its soils, was beginning to favor independence. No longer tethered to shallow pools, they slipped between shadows, beneath roots, across windswept ridges. Small, scaled, watching, waiting for their moment. And when it came, it wasn't marked by a roar or a leap, it was marked by a silence, the kind of silence that spreads when a familiar rhythm fades. Amphibians, once the gatekeepers of life on land, began to retreat. Not all at once, not with drama, but gradually, like mist pulling back from a warm morning field. The ecosystems they left behind did not stay empty. Reptiles filled them not by becoming faster or stronger right away, but by being present when others could not, in dry years, in late seasons, on upland ridges where no swamp remained. And presence, over time, became dominance. That dominance wasn't just physical, it rewrote the structure of entire food webs. Amphibian-based systems had relied on water as a central axis. Breeding grounds, feeding grounds, nurseries for young. But reptiles operated on different terms. They could feed further afield, nest in crevices, not just puddles, hunt beneath leaf litter or under sun-bleached logs. Insects, once safe at a distance from water, now faced predators above, below, and between. Herbivorous invertebrates met scaled jaws in places where they'd once found sanctuary, and reptiles began not only to hunt, but to compete. Some shifted toward insectivory, others tried seeds, some began to nibble at carrion. Each adaptation was a vote cast toward ecological resilience. Less brilliance, more flexibility. And flexibility, it turned out, was the best kind of power. Even their movement changed. Reptiles began to experiment with posture limbs positioned slightly more beneath the body, allowing for bursts of speed and better support on uneven terrain. Nothing like the towering gait of dinosaurs to come, but the blueprint had started. We find this not just in bones, but in the trace fossils they left behind. Trackways, footprints in dried mud, scratches beneath sandstone ledges. These are the ghost signatures of forgotten afternoons, a lizard-like creature sunning itself, or sprinting after prey, or fleeing a shadow we'll never name. Each track tells us more than shape. It tells us presence. It tells us confidence. And confidence was earned. As amphibians declined, reptiles didn't just occupy more space, they adapted to it. In the fossil record, we see bursts of reptilian radiation, an increase in diversity, form, and ecological role. Some grew larger, some grew spikier. Some flattened their bodies, learning to glide or hide. Others bulked up, building armor against bites that hadn't evolved yet. They weren't reacting to predators. They were preparing for them. The gamble was working. Still, there was no guarantee. The earth was always moving beneath their feet. Swamps dried, forests shifted, volcanoes rumbled, and competition was never idle. Every evolutionary success carried a shadow, the cost of complexity, of specialization, of becoming too good at only one thing. But the reptiles weren't rushing. They were watching. They were adjusting. And they were laying the groundwork for something larger, something bolder. Because the gamble wasn't just about surviving dry land, it was about learning how to own it and rewrite its future. To rewrite a world, you don't have to conquer it, you only have to last. And that's what the reptiles did. Through shifting climates, through the collapse of forests, through the slow rearrangement of Earth's surface, they lasted. With amniotic eggs, internal lungs, and scaled skin, they carried their world inside them. They no longer reacted to the environment, they shaped how they moved through it. They didn't need to be large, they didn't need to be flashy, they just needed to keep going when others stopped. And because of that, every tetrapod alive today, every bird, every mammal, every reptile traces its lineage back to this gamble. This quiet, leathery egg, this decision to close the loop, to carry the ocean within, even us, because humans are reptiles in a way. Not by classification, but by inheritance. We breathe through lungs. We gestate internally. We've adapted to dry climates, and we've shed the need to return to water to be born. The leap that reptiles made into independence, into insulation, echoes in our anatomy. Our skin, our spine, our way of reproducing, our fear of drowning. We don't just remember the swamp. We remember what it took to leave it, and it took risk. The fossil record doesn't speak in victories. It speaks in persistence, in layers, in the slow accumulation of decisions that worked just enough to survive. What makes a gamble worthwhile is not whether it wins, but whether it allows you to play the next round. Reptiles bet on the future. They bet on dryness, on isolation, on compact, mobile life. And that bet survived everything the Carboniferous and Permian could throw at it. When the forests fell, when the oxygen dropped, when the rain no longer came, amphibians shrank back into their wet refuges. Reptiles walked forward, and with each step, they changed the rules. Soon, some would grow larger, teeth would sharpen, gaits would rise. From these small, early bodies would come archosaurs and synapsids, lineages that would go on to produce crocodiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. But here in the mudstone and memory was the hinge, the inflection point, the decision to evolve not just bigger or faster, but differently. It wasn't an apex predator that changed the world. It was a small, overlooked crawler with a better idea of what an egg could be. And because of that, the floodplains, hills, and sun-bleached deserts of Earth began to open, and life poured in. So when we hold a fossilized Hylonomus in our hand, or brush soil from the tailbone of a Paleothyrus, we are not holding a relic. We are holding a blueprint, a love letter to adaptation, a gamble made by something too small to matter until it did. This is what the reptiles taught us. You don't have to dominate to endure. You only have to be ready when the moment comes. And the moment always comes quietly, then all at once, changing everything. In the stillness of rock beds and the hushed breath of museum halls, we can still hear it coming. The echo of a choice, the shape of a shell, the beginning of a new world. In the stillness of rock beds and the hushed breath of museum halls, we can still hear it coming. But what if the echo fades? The world that had once nurtured giants of limb, of lung, of wing began to shift, slowly at first, subtly. A change in air no creature could name, but all could feel. The atmosphere that had once been heavy with oxygen, thick, rich, electric, began to thin. Not catastrophically, not like a collapse, but steadily. This was not extinction by fire, it was extinction by breath. At the height of the Carboniferous, Earth's oxygen levels may have peaked around 35% compared to the 21% we breathe today. That difference wasn't just chemical, it was architectural. It shaped bodies, enabled mass, fed the fire that lit both forests and metabolisms. It gave rise to creatures whose scale would later seem impossible. But the rise had a ceiling, and ceilings press back. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, something changed. Global temperatures began to climb. rainfall patterns fractured. Coastal swamps that once swallowed carbon by the megaton began to vanish. Trees fell, and fewer grew to replace them. Peat layers slowed their accumulation. Less carbon was buried, and less burial meant less drawdown. Carbon dioxide crept back into the sky, and as it did, oxygen made its quiet retreat. It's easy to imagine this like a sudden suffocation. It wasn't. The air still carried breath. But the margin narrowed, the buffer thinned. For creatures evolved in a world of abundance, that narrowing was unforgiving. Arthropods felt it first. Their size, glorious, exaggerated, was always at the mercy of diffusion. They didn't have lungs, no diaphragm, no red blood cells, just spiracles and tracheal tubes, direct lines from the outside world into their tissues. In a high-oxygen world, that system worked beautifully. It flooded the body with air, feeding flight, movement, growth. But as oxygen declined, so did their reach. Tracheal systems couldn't stretch forever. They couldn't push against resistance. They weren't built to compensate. So the giants shrank. First imperceptibly, then measurably, then completely. The skies once ruled by dragonflies the size of hawks grew quieter. Meganeura disappeared. Others followed. It wasn't just the air. Predators changed. Amphibians gave way to reptiles. New jaws evolved. New eyes, adapted for long-range vision. Faster strikes. Drier land. Giants, once safe by sheer scale, were now targets. Size became a liability. A slower molt, a longer juvenile stage, a bigger silhouette in a world learning how to bite harder. Evolution does not reward what worked, only what still works. And so, the age of the oversized insect drew to a close, not with extinction alone, but with recalibration, a return to smaller forms, more efficient, less magnificent, but better suited to the new game. And that question, how big is too big, was no longer rhetorical. It had an answer now, and the answer was this: only as big as your air allows, only as long as the sky still holds its breath. And the sky was changing. It wasn't just the thinning oxygen that rewrote the rules of size. It was what came with it: shifts in temperature, seasons, and species. Evolution isn't a single pressure. It's a contest of timing, of accidents, of who's watching when you blink. And as the Permian opened, there were new eyes watching. Reptiles, once quiet contenders in the amphibian era, had stepped into the foreground. Their dry skin, internal lungs, and shelled eggs gave them reach, but now they were evolving weapons too. Teeth, claws, faster metabolisms, better vision. Some could even regulate their body temperature better than their cold-blooded ancestors. Suddenly, size alone wasn't protection. A 10-inch dragonfly in the Carboniferous sky was a terror. But now, a larger body meant a larger target. Wings broad enough to catch thermals were now easy for predators to spot, track, and snatch. A slower molt could be interrupted. A nymph-stage predator could become prey before even leaving the water. Speed was the new shield. Camouflage was the new armor. And giants, so good at dominating space, were bad at hiding. Even the ground turned against them. With the drying of the swamps, habitats fragmented. Wetlands that had once been vast, tangled safety nets became smaller, scattered, seasonal. A giant insect needed stable, humid conditions to survive each molt. But now, a dry season could mean desiccation. A drought could mean death before metamorphosis. So smaller species had the edge. They needed less to survive, less oxygen, less moisture, less food, and so they began to outcompete the titans simply by being more adaptable. We see this story not in bones but in gaps. The fossil record of the early Permian shows a marked decline in arthropod gigantism. The wingspans shorten, the trackways shrink. The once glorious footprints of Arthropleura, the 6-foot millipede that once ruled the forest floor, vanish entirely. Its extinction is not pinned to a single killer, but to a web of pressures that made its existence unsustainable. Too big, too slow, too vulnerable to change, and so the world shrank, not in richness, but in scale. Where once it had been measured in feet of chitin and sails of wing, it was now measured in cleverness, in resilience, in the ability to vanish when danger came. In this way, the Permian was less a revolution than a reckoning. The grand experiment of high-oxygen gigantism had run its course, but the lessons remained. Size is not dominance. Dominance is not permanence. In the arena of survival, sometimes smaller means faster. Faster means safer. Safer means you live long enough to reproduce. And evolution cares only for what happens next. The future would belong to creatures that could turn less into more. That could win not by towering but by enduring, because when everything around you shifts, and the rules keep changing, the greatest power isn't mass or height or grandeur. It's agility, it's timing, it's the ability to vanish and return when the world is ready. But some worlds don't come back. High oxygen gave us giants, its decline took them away. And today, even as life thrives in complexity and scale, the sky remains grounded. The question still echoes: why don't dragonflies the size of eagles soar above our rivers anymore? The answer lies in chemistry and in physics. In limits that never left. Modern insects still breathe through spiracles, tiny openings along their exoskeletons that feed air directly into a web of internal tubes. These tracheae work fine at small sizes. Air moves in by diffusion, spreading passively into tissues. But there's a ceiling to that system, a point where surface area can no longer meet the oxygen demands of mass. In the Carboniferous, higher oxygen meant diffusion could go further. A thicker atmosphere pushed more molecules deeper into the insect's body. But at today's levels, just 21% oxygen, the system chokes out at scale. You can grow wide, you can grow long, but your cells still need breath. And breath has a budget. Try to scale up a modern dragonfly to the size of a hawk, and its inner tracheal network would collapse under the strain. It couldn't supply enough oxygen to power its wings. Its muscles would starve. Its flight would fail before it left the reeds. Even modern giants like beetles, stick insects, or some moths hit this wall. They grow as large as they can within the limits, but never beyond, not without help, not without a changed atmosphere. And that constraint isn't unique to insects. Birds, mammals, even reptiles face their own ceilings. Ever wonder why the largest flying animals that ever lived, pterosaurs like Quetzalcoatlus, pushed 10-11 meters in wingspan, but never more? Because lift has rules. Wings must balance surface area with muscle power. As size increases, mass rises faster than strength. Eventually, there's a tipping point where no amount of flapping will get you off the ground. Gravity wins. Blood can't reach the brain. Limbs buckle under their own weight, and on Earth, that tipping point comes sooner than we'd like to imagine. The biggest animals today live in the sea where buoyancy grants reprieve. Blue whales can grow to 100 feet not because biology changed, but because physics did. Water lifts what air cannot. It carries what gravity would crush. The ocean is, in a way, the last echo of the Carboniferous, a world where size is once again allowed to stretch. But in the air? In the trees? The age of giants is gone. Today's dragonflies hover like whispers, not hurricanes. And in that contrast between what was and what is, we see the quiet grip of constraint. Not every path remains open. Some doors, once closed, require more than evolution to reopen. They require an atmosphere willing to dream big again. And they remind us that biology doesn't build on dreams alone. It builds on limits and learns how to grow within them. Gigantism wasn't just a phase, it was a lesson. That the rules of life are written in air pressure and cell walls, in the diffusion of gases and the pull of gravity. That wonder has physics. That ambition needs scaffolding. And that even the most extraordinary bodies can fall silent when the sky stops whispering in their favor. And so, life stopped reaching for the skies. Not entirely, but cautiously. The Carboniferous giants faded, leaving behind not extinction, but adjustment. In their absence, ecosystems didn't collapse, they recalibrated. The biomass once locked in 6-foot millipedes and dragonflies the size of gulls found new homes in smaller, faster, hungrier creatures. Instead of a few dominant giants, the world now favored many adaptable forms. The forest floor, once crunched beneath the armor of Arthropleura, became a theater for smaller scavengers and opportunists. The skies, once ruled by titanic wings, gave way to buzzing, darting flyers who spent less time gliding and more time hiding. Predation didn't stop, it became sharper. Reptiles with better lungs and more active metabolisms now stalked the edges of rivers. Amphibians, once the apex predators of the swamps, fell into narrower niches. Some retreated into the wet corners of the world, others faded entirely. The Permian was an age of growing pressure of arms races that weren't just about strength, but efficiency. Because in a world where oxygen cost more, every movement mattered, and movement defined who lived and who didn't. Insects adapted in kind, smaller wings, faster life cycles. Some developed complex social behaviors, nesting, division of labor, pheromone communication. Evolution, unburdened by mass, began to lean toward intelligence, toward coordination. The body was no longer a fortress. It was a tool. Gigantism had been impressive, but subtlety won the long game. We see it today in ants farming aphids, in termites building vast mounds with air conditioning tunnels, in wasps teaching their larvae with paralyzed prey. These are not echoes of giants. They are what came after, what survived, what succeeded in a less generous world. And from this new balance, something else emerged. Balance itself. No longer could one species dominate by size alone. The Carboniferous had tilted its ecosystems toward a few massive players. But the decline in oxygen spread opportunity. Diversity blossomed. Food webs tangled. Niches fractured and multiplied. The system grew more complex, not just vertically, but laterally. It wasn't just who stood tallest, it was who fit best. And in this network of smaller lives, innovation thrived. New reproductive strategies, new sensory systems, new chemical defenses. Nature became more experimental and more brutal. Selection favored creativity over bulk. This was no longer the age of giants. It was the age of specialists. And the template this created a world of predators and prey shaped by constraint, not abundance, would echo through every evolutionary branch that followed, including our own. Because constraint, when embraced, doesn't kill progress. It refines it. It channels energy into new forms, not by expanding outward, but by digging inward into brain, into behavior, into collaboration. The fall of gigantism was not the end of ambition. It was its redirection, and even now we live inside that redirection. Every breath you take, 21% oxygen, give or take, is a quiet echo of a past more flammable, more generous, more dangerous. Your lungs, your bloodstream, your brain all tuned to that ratio. Every cell in your body evolved under the ceiling set long ago. You are, in a sense, a creature of limits, and yet you've broken so many of them. We've left the ground, pierced the sky, and stood on the moon. We've created machines that breathe for us, tanks that hold oxygen at pressure, rockets that carry fire beyond the atmosphere that once shaped our size. In doing so, we haven't escaped the oxygen ceiling, we've externalized it. We've bent it to our will, carried it with us into places we were never meant to go, but we still pay for it. Our largest animals remain sea-bound. Our most powerful flyers remain light-boned. Our machines may lift us, but our biology always brings us back down. Human lungs don't scale well. Our brains need constant oxygen. High altitudes thin the air, and we feel it. On Everest, above 80 meters, the death zone begins where the air holds only a third of the oxygen we're built for. Without assistance, we fail. Our past reminds us. Oxygen is not just background, it's destiny. And if the past had more of it more than we do now, what happens if we change it again? Today, oxygen levels are stable. but CO2 is rising. The carbon that ancient forests buried, the very act that once lifted oxygen to its zenith, is now returning to the sky. As we burn coal, oil and gas, we reverse a process that took millions of years. Slowly, subtly, the balance shifts again, and with it, so might the ceiling, not just for size, but for systems. Wildfires grow more intense. Insects shift their ranges. Respiration becomes stress. Coral reefs bleach under strain, and forests burn where they once thrived. We're not headed back to the Carboniferous, not in atmosphere, not in fauna, but we are, once again, pushing the bounds of breath. We are testing the limits of the lungs that carried us here. Perhaps that's the final lesson of the giants. They weren't just stories of excess. They were warnings written in the bones of wings and the spiral tubes of insects long gone. They show us what happens when the world becomes too breathable, and what happens when it forgets how to breathe at all. So hold this in mind. Next time you step outside, every breath you take is a negotiation, a relic, a result. You are not just a human in the present, you are a survivor of atmospheres. And the air you carry is a gift forged in fire, forest and time, and the ceiling above you? It's not just made of sky, it's made of choices. It's made of everything we do with fire, and everything we leave in the ground. It's shaped by what we remember and what we choose to forget. Because even now, the story of breath isn't finished. We are still writing it, one inhalation at a time. But the air wasn't always ours to shape. Once, it shaped everything, and then it changed. The Carboniferous had been generous. For millions of years, lush, swamp-drenched continents inhaled carbon and exhaled fire-ready oxygen. But toward the end of that verdant reign, the balance began to shift. The bubble that gave rise to dragonflies the size of gulls and millipedes the length of sofas didn't pop all at once. It leaked, it dried, it broke. What followed wasn't a single event, but a slow unraveling, a collapse that would rewrite the surface of the earth. Giant insects vanished. Amphibians lost their grip on dominance. Whole ecosystems, once stable for eons, cracked apart, and it began with the swamps, the great coal forests dense with lycopsids, horsetails, and seed ferns were never permanent. Their dominance depended on wet, anoxic soils that locked away carbon and kept decomposition at bay. But as continents shifted, mountain ranges rose. Rainfall patterns warped. Regions that had once been drenched year-round began to dry. The sky changed color. The wind shifted tone. The rhythm of decay began to hum louder. In the fossil record, we see it clearly. Coal seams thick. Dark bands representing ancient swamp floors suddenly give way to sandstone, silt, and red beds. Upland soils. Oxidized clays. The signs of rivers changing course and wetlands retreating. These transitions, preserved in rock, are not abstract. They are moments of loss. Habitats blinking out. Muck turning to dust. Trees falling in silence, never replaced. Without swamps, the great oxygen engine slowed. Less burial of plant matter meant more carbon stayed in the cycle. More decay, more respiration. The very process that had once created breathable abundance began to reverse itself. Oxygen levels, already fluctuating, started to decline, and with them went the giants. Giant insects, in particular, were exquisitely tuned to the atmospheric conditions of their age. Their internal tracheal systems, dependent on passive diffusion, required high ambient oxygen to fuel large bodies. As that concentration dropped, the biological scaffolding of gigantism weakened. Flight faltered, respiration failed, populations shrank. The fossil record doesn't show a clean line of extinction. It shows a tapering. Fewer large specimens, fewer wing impressions, more fragmentation. Insects didn't vanish. But the age of sky-filling, 4-foot winged predators was ending, and below, the amphibians struggled too. Once rulers of the swampy margins, many were slow, moisture-dependent, and vulnerable to desiccation. The drying of their world meant more than discomfort, it meant death. Reproductive cycles, often tied to still water, broke down. Eggs dried, skins cracked. The great temnospondyls and lepospondyls, strange, sprawling forms with wide heads and limbless bodies, began to vanish from the fossil record. They were not built for change. Evolution, by its nature, is conservative. It preserves what works until it doesn't. And when the rules of the game shift, when the air thins, the swamps dry, and the fires dim, the forms that once ruled become burdens. The giants had no answer. They could only fall, but their collapse left a silence that echoed. The Carboniferous forests, once teeming with buzzing wings and squirming limbs, began to fade not all at once, but in patches. Biodiversity shrank. The tapestry of life, once thick with strange and specialized forms, began to fray. And the silence was not metaphorical. It was geological. In rock layers around the world, we see fewer fossil traces from these once dominant creatures. Arthropods that had ruled the air and forest floor became smaller, rarer. Amphibians that sprawled in freshwater lagoons began to vanish from the record. Trackways thin out. Bone beds dwindle. What once felt like a global bloom of life now appears as a dwindling flicker, growing faint. So what changed? At the heart of this transformation was not a single event, but a series of interwoven pressures, climate, chemistry, and competition. Global drying was underway. As Pangaea assembled, the tectonic collision of continents produced vast inland regions. Mountains rose, rainfall patterns shifted, and the world's wet lungs began to dry. Without swamps, the burial of organic carbon decreased. That meant less oxygen production and more exposure of plant matter to decay. Decay isn't just rot, it's respiration in reverse. As bacteria broke down dead wood and leaf matter, they consumed oxygen and released CO2s. The atmosphere that once glowed with chemical potential began to dull. Oxygen, once as high as 35%, began to drop, perhaps falling below 25% by the early Permian. And as it dropped, the air's power changed. Fires burned differently. Breathing became harder. The very thing that once fueled abundance now starved it. Physiologically, insects and amphibians were most at risk. Insects rely on diffusion through tiny tubes, tracheae, to move oxygen from their body surface inward. This system works beautifully in small bodies or in atmospheres rich in O2. But as the percentage drops, the distance oxygen can travel shrinks. Bigger bodies suffocate first. This is why Meganeura disappeared. It's why no dragonfly today reaches that size. For amphibians, the threat was even more direct. Many of them absorbed oxygen through their skin, an adaptation perfect for damp environments, but disastrous in dry ones. As swamps turned seasonal or vanished altogether, amphibians lost their ecological foothold. Their skin cracked, their eggs desiccated, their numbers fell. Even reproduction became dangerous. A single dry season could wipe out an entire generation. The mud that once cradled life became dust. Migration wasn't an option. Many of these species were slow, territorial, unable to outrun the shifting climate. Trapped by the very ecosystems they once ruled, they dwindled with heartbreaking inevitability. Yet not all was lost. Reptiles, with their dry, scaly skin and amniotic eggs, began to emerge not just as survivors, but as opportunists. They could roam where amphibians could not. They could reproduce away from water. They breathed with lungs that didn't rely on the softness of skin. They were, in essence, designed for this new world. But the giants? The ones that once filled the sky, patrolled the forest floor, and hummed through the canopies? They had no such advantage. Their forms were too tied to an atmosphere that no longer existed. And so, in the turning of the world's breath, evolution made its decision. Not with malice, with math. That's the cruelty of deep time. It doesn't need a villain. It needs only imbalance. And imbalance was everywhere. As oxygen fell and the swamps dried, every system connected to them began to falter. Plants evolved to thrive in saturated soils now found themselves exposed. Root systems failed. Canopy gaps widened. The once thick forests thinned not because they were chopped, but because they were outgrown by a new kind of world. With fewer trees came fewer homes. With fewer homes came fewer insects. And with fewer insects came fewer amphibians. Predators became prey. Specialists starved. Each extinction was a tremor. Together, they were an earthquake. Even fire changed its mind. In a 35% oxygen world, flames could leap from branch to branch with ease. Even damp wood burned. But as the oxygen dropped, fires struggled to spread. In some regions, charcoal deposits so abundant in the Carboniferous suddenly vanish from the record. Less fire meant less clearing. Less clearing meant less regeneration. The self-pruning forests of the Carboniferous became tangled, stagnant. Light struggled to reach the forest floor. Photosynthesis itself slowed. The planet dimmed. And still, life tried to adapt. Some insects shrank. Wings shortened. Breathing structures became more compact. These were not triumphs, they were concessions. Biological compromises written in desperate DNA. The great experiment of arthropod gigantism had reached its limit, and the roll of the evolutionary dice would not favor it again. For amphibians, the outlook was worse. Unlike insects, they could not simply miniaturize or wait it out. Their entire physiology was built around moisture and stillness. As weather patterns became more seasonal, amphibians encountered new pressures. Droughts that stretched longer, floods that came too fast, eggs that dried before hatching, or were washed away before settling. Some attempted to evolve tougher skins, others ventured further from water, but found nothing waiting for them. And into that vacuum, reptiles expanded. They didn't need perfect conditions, just survivable ones. Their eggs were armored with shells, their lungs drawn deep within the body. They could regulate moisture loss. They could bask and breathe and crawl across dust where amphibians perished. This wasn't a competition, it was a replacement. And through that slow replacement, we begin to see the outlines of a new Earth. One not ruled by insects or by amphibians, but by vertebrates that could leave the swamp and never return. We call it transition, but from the perspective of the giants, it was collapse, and for the creatures that came next, it was inheritance. The age of damp breath and soft skin was ending. The age of scales and stride had begun. And though it happened over millions of years, the signal it left behind was stark like a curtain falling, slowly but completely, over a world that once buzzed, squirmed, and swam in warm, breathable twilight. That's how extinction often looks in the fossil record. Not a sharp break, but a fading signal. And yet, the silence holds stories. Geologists and paleontologists don't just dig for skeletons, they dig for absences. In the Permian strata that follow the Carboniferous, they find fewer insect wing impressions, fewer large amphibian bones, fewer trackways pressed into what was once soft, wet earth. What's missing is just as important as what remains, and what remains tells of survivors, not rulers. Take Hylonomus, one of the earliest reptiles known from the fossil record. Its remains were found fossilized inside the hollow trunk of a fallen tree in Nova Scotia. An ancient, lycopsid log, long decayed from the inside. The creature may have entered to nest or hunt, only to become trapped and buried over time. It was small, lizard-like, no larger than your hand. But it was something new. Hylonomus had no need for gills or water-bound eggs. It didn't rely on moist skin for respiration. Its lungs were efficient, its limbs adapted for crawling, its skin resistant to evaporation. In a drying world, that wasn't just an advantage, it was a passport. From Scotland comes another hint, West Lothiana. Sometimes called the coal lizard, it lived in similar ecosystems and displays a mixture of amphibian and reptilian features. Perhaps not a true reptile, but close. Evolution does not draw clear lines, it sketches in grey. But between these scattered fossils, a pattern emerges, a shift in power. Reptiles, once marginal, began to fill the spaces left behind. They ventured onto floodplains, up slopes, into dry forests. They grew more diverse, more specialized, and in the layers above, you begin to find them more often. Bones of early synapsids, mammal ancestors, teeth with serrations, hints of warm-blooded metabolism, deeper lungs, longer legs. Meanwhile, the insects grew quiet. Where once we had imprints of wings 2 feet wide, we now find the fossils of beetles and smaller dragonflies, creatures that would be at home in today's world. Their oxygen-hungry ancestors had vanished. The atmosphere simply couldn't carry them anymore, and the amphibians? Still present, but diminished. No longer apex predators, they retreated to niche habitats, swamps, ponds, shaded hollows. Their lineage would survive, yes, but not in the same form, not with the same reach. Their time in the sun was over. This isn't the end of the Permian, not yet, but it is the end of an era, and in the pages of stone, that ending is quiet. There is no meteorite, no lava flow, just the long, slow exhale of a world losing breath, a redirection of destiny, a rebalancing of the air. Even the rocks seem subdued. The colours fade from coal black to rust red. The lush becomes the arid. Whole chapters of life condensed into inches of sediment waiting, silently, for eyes that know how to listen. Sometimes, what you don't find in the fossil record is the loudest signal of all. Not every extinction leaves a graveyard. Some leave only space, a vacancy in the shape of a dragonfly's wing, and in that space, new players entered. But the echoes of the giants never truly faded. They left behind more than fossils. They left legacies written into the structure of life itself. The air had once allowed excess, bold experiments in size, breath, and locomotion. But when the world shifted, it didn't just punish the large, it rewarded the adaptable. The amniotic egg, the dry skin, the internalized lungs. These were not glamorous innovations, they were survival tools, quiet revolutions that took root while the spotlight was still on the giants. Reptiles expanded not by dominating but by enduring. Where oxygen fell, they didn't fight it. They flexed with it. And in that flexibility, they opened a new evolutionary arena. Because when one world ends, another begins. The giants of the Carboniferous were creatures of abundance. They didn't hoard energy, they thrived on overflow. But such overflow was a geological illusion, a rare atmospheric spike propped up by vast coal swamp sequestration and a brief alignment of conditions. When those conditions shifted, the illusion shattered, and the beings that depended on it, no matter how mighty, fell. This is not a story of punishment. It's a story of scale. The Earth does not promise balance. It experiments with imbalance and watches to see what lives. We often think of extinction as failure. But in deep time, extinction is currency. It purchases room. It funds innovation. It forces life to recalculate, redraw, rethink. Without the fall of the giants, there would be no path cleared for reptiles to rise. No open land, no evolutionary vacuum. The bones of the fallen became the bedrock of a future yet unimagined. Their disappearance was not an erasure. It was a turning, and we still live in that turn. Today, every insect that breathes through tracheae inherits the legacy of those that once outgrew the sky. Every frog that shelters under a leaf is kin to the amphibians that once ruled the swamps. Every lizard, bird, or mammal that lays claim to dry land is walking on ground made possible by collapse, by reduction, by breath, lost and regained. We rarely think of air as history, but it island. And the air we breathe today, filtered, thinned, reshaped over millions of years, is a direct descendant of that carbon-rich, flame-fed past. It is no longer kind to giants. It is no longer willing to carry such weight, and so we carry their memory instead. When we study their fossils, we are not just reconstructing bodies. We are listening for the last breaths of a world that once burned too bright. We are tracing the shadows of wings that no longer beat. We are reading the obituary of a kind of ambition written not in hubris but in oxygen. The giants are gone. But the lesson remains. Even air has limits, and when life pushes past them, the world pushes back. We would do well to remember that before it happens again, because we too are reshaping the air, and the earth is listening, always, whether we want it to or not. And now, in the hush that follows the collapse, it listens to something new. Not the thunder of wings, not the rumble of giant amphibians dragging themselves through soupy fern bogs, but the softer, quieter signatures of survival, the scrape of claw against dry soil, the click of eggshells, the near-silent pull of lungs drawing breath in thinner air. The Carboniferous is over, and from its ashes the reptiles rise. These are not monsters. Not yet. No towering limbs, no snarling jaws. Many are still no larger than a modern lizard or rat, but their strength lies not in spectacle. It lies in blueprint. They are built to last. In a world where excess became extinction, endurance becomes power. And reptiles newly adapted, quietly spreading, carry the tools for survival within their very bodies. Their lungs are no longer passive bags of air. They've evolved structures that pull in oxygen more efficiently, deeper into the bloodstream. In a world where the sky has thinned, this becomes a superpower. Amphibians, by contrast, still cling to moisture. Their skin remains their weakness. It leaks. It demands. But reptiles are sealed, dry-skinned, watertight. Their eggs do not require puddles or pools. Instead, they carry their own ecosystems, a protective shell, a yolk for nourishment, a series of membranes that allow gas exchange while preventing desiccation. It is, in essence, a mobile pond, an amphibian's legacy, refined for a harsher earth, and that refinement changes everything. It liberates reproduction from the swamp. It allows colonization of uplands, floodplains, ridges, even deserts to be. It means reptiles can lay eggs where others cannot follow. And when those eggs hatch, the young are not larval, not water-bound. They are miniature adults ready to crawl, hunt, breathe. The ecological rules begin to rewrite themselves. The air is no longer kind. The climate swings harder. Rainforests fragment. Droughts lengthen. But the reptiles persist, not because they fight the changes, but because they are built for them. Evolution in this moment is not a contest of speed or strength. It is a question of internal design, and the reptiles have the answer. We find their traces in the rocks of the early Permian. Small skeletons, narrow skulls, limb bones adapted not for swimming but for walking, vertebrae spaced for flexibility. In Texas, Oklahoma, and parts of Russia, paleontologists uncover layer after layer of these ancient pioneers. Some are insect eaters, others plant chewers. A few are early predators already beginning to grow larger, stronger, more ambitious. But they all share the same gift, independence from the water. It is not as flashy as flight, but it's more permanent, because from this point forward, life is no longer tethered to the wettest parts of Earth. It begins to stretch, slowly, into the dry. It begins to speak a new language of patience, of distance, of staying power. And in doing so, it sets the stage for everything that will come next. To stretch into the dry was one thing, to diversify within it that was another. And the reptiles did not do this as a single shape. They split. From their early ranks emerged two great lineages, divided by the architecture of their skulls and the futures they would chase, synapsids and diapsids. Names that sound technical, almost sterile, but within them lay the seeds of mammals, lizards, dinosaurs, and birds. The line between them is drawn in bone. Look closely at the side of a reptilian skull. In the synapsids, There is a single hole and opening behind the eye socket called a temporal fenestra. This gap allowed for more powerful jaw muscles, better bite force, greater control. In the diapsids, there are two such holes. A dual window design that made their skulls lighter and more versatile. The distinction seems small, but it ripples forward into millions of years of competition, and at the dawn of the Permian, the synapsids surged ahead. They were the dominant branch, not just surviving, but thriving. Some looked like squat lizards with oversized heads. Others were already experimenting with strange tooth shapes, stronger limbs, and thermoregulation. Names like Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus would come later, but their ancestors were already moving through these ancient landscapes like quiet architects of the future. Diapsids, meanwhile, lingered in the margins. They remained smaller, more cautious. Insects still made up much of their diet. Their role was not yet dominance. It was observation, refinement. Evolution is not always about who wins first. Sometimes it's about who waits best. But both groups shared one truth. The air was changing them. As oxygen dropped, efficiency became everything. Metabolism, lung design, circulatory systems. What had once been a playground of giants was now a crucible of constraints. Those that could extract more from less, those that could do more with every breath began to flourish. Fossils from this period show an increase in bone density and limb robustness. Trackways suggest creatures with a more upright gait, shifting from the sprawling stance of amphibians to something more suited for land traversal. It wasn't just about surviving dryness, it was about mastering terrain, and with this mastery came ambition. We see the beginnings of territory. Predatory behaviors, nesting strategies. The reptiles were not simply animals, they were pioneers, explorers of an Earth that was becoming increasingly vertical, harsh, and open. The swamps had narrowed into ribbons. Forests had retreated. In their place stood vast plains and rocky uplands. To cross them required lungs, legs, and resilience. Synapsids pushed forward. Diapsids observed, adapted, and lingered in the shadow. But both were laying foundations. What emerged in this time were not just two clades. They were ideologies. Two survival strategies etched into bone and muscle. And while one would rise fast, the other would rise far. Because evolution, in its patience, does not play favorites. It plays the long game. And the race between these bloodlines was only beginning. Evolution does not reward effort. It rewards efficiency. And when the atmosphere shifted, it redrew the scoring system. The creatures of this new world were not just competing for food or space. They were competing for air. For every breath, every heartbeat, every cell that asked for more than the sky was now willing to give. And this quiet war of lungs, blood, and breath would decide the winners of the next age. We often imagine oxygen as a constant, but it is not. It is a privilege, and in the Permian, that privilege was shrinking. By this time, atmospheric oxygen levels had fallen from their Carboniferous highs down from 35% toward the modern baseline of 21%, and lower still in some intervals. Fire became less frequent. Meginsects disappeared. The thick, wet air that once fueled giants had thinned into something sharper, harsher, less forgiving, and life had to respond. Those that failed to adapt to the new oxygen regime vanished quietly, their bones lost in uncatalogued strata. But others, those with the right physiology, rose. Reptiles thrived because their lungs were not simple sacs. They were multi-chambered, ventilated, structured for flow. Birds, their distant descendants, would later take this to the extreme with unidirectional airflow and air sacs. But even in these early reptiles we see the precursors: rigid rib cages, muscular breathing, reduced reliance on cutaneous gas exchange. They weren't just resistant to oxygen decline, they were optimized for it. Synapsids took a different route. Their skulls became more complex, their nasal passages more folded, perhaps allowing better moisture retention and air warming. Some species show signs of higher metabolic rates, endothermic tendencies in their bloodline, long before mammals. It was, in many ways, a gamble. Burn hotter, move faster, but require more oxygen per unit of energy. For a time, it worked. The early Permian is filled with successful synapsid predators, some lean, some bulky, some already building toward warm-blooded futures, but their hunger for oxygen also made them vulnerable. The more they needed, the less they could tolerate its loss. Diapsids, more conservative, more modular, bided their time. They made fewer demands. And in that restraint, they gained something potent, resilience. Because as oxygen fell further, and as the environment continued to destabilize, those who could survive on less began to matter more. This was not a sudden revolution, it was attrition. Each drought, each fire, each slow-motion ecosystem collapse tested the limits of breath. And each time, those with higher oxygen needs paid a steeper price. It wasn't just physiology, it was geography. Diapsids began to spread into marginal environments, arid zones, rocky uplands, places where oxygen was scarcer, prey harder to find, and water unreliable. They did not dominate these spaces, they simply endured them. And endurance, over time, becomes power. The fossil record during this transition is subtle. Bone microstructures shift, tooth enamel patterns change, limb proportions adjust for more efficient locomotion. No single fossil screams victory. But the pattern speaks clearly. Those who asked less of the world were able to stay longer in it. Today, we can trace this transformation in our own bloodlines. Mammals, descendants of synapsids, carry high oxygen demands. We pant. We sweat. Our bodies run hot and fast. We are evolutionary gamblers, powered by breath. But reptiles, and later, the line that becomes birds, carried a quieter promise. Not speed, not heat, but continuity. They were, in essence, designed to survive the bad days, the long droughts, the thin air. And in the age that was coming, those bad days were only beginning. Endurance doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like hiding under a rock. Sometimes it looks like laying 10 eggs instead of 5, or needing half as much water, or living long enough to lay just one more clutch when others can't. In the brutal, ever-shifting climate of the Permian, the future didn't belong to the bold. It belonged to the small. And that was where the true revolution took root. As oxygen thinned and ecosystems collapsed in patches, size became a burden. Large-bodied predators that once ruled the swamps or forest fringes now struggled to sustain themselves. Every heartbeat asked too much, every movement drained too fast, and in their shadows sometimes literally tiny reptiles crept, waited, and adapted. The fossil record begins to change in this era. The bones get finer, the footprints get smaller. Species once dismissed as fringe players become central to survival webs. Their names are often obscure: Captohynus, Proterothyrus, Petrolacosaurus. Few will ever be famous, but these were the quiet champions creatures whose modest demands let them slip between the cracks of extinction. They didn't just survive, they spread. Because smallness wasn't just a physiological advantage, it was a geographic one. A smaller body meant more options. They could live under leaf litter, in rock crevices, inside dry logs or burrows. They could disappear into places where the big ones couldn't follow. And when food was scarce, they needed less of it. When water vanished, they held out longer. They were less visible, but more persistent. And over time, that persistence added up. It allowed entire lineages to avoid extinction events that toppled their larger cousins. It kept genetic diversity alive through dry spells, heat waves, and atmospheric shocks. It allowed them to radiate into niches newly opened by each local collapse. The ground may have shifted beneath them, but they kept moving forward. There is something humbling in this. We often think of evolutionary success in terms of dominance, the top of the food chain, the biggest claws, the fastest sprint. But in deep time, survival is rarely so dramatic. It's quiet, it's unglamorous. It looks like staying still when others run, eating what's left when others starve. It looks like adaptation, not aggression. And the small reptiles of the Permian understood this at a cellular level. Their bones grew slowly but steadily. Their lungs remained effective. Their reproductive strategies leaned toward quantity over investment. And their habits became less specialized, more generalist, more opportunistic. This was not brilliance. It was baseline adaptability. But in a world that kept changing the rules, that flexibility became a kind of genius, because the Earth was not finished reshaping itself. And the worst was still to come. But the creatures who would inherit it, they were already here. Unnoticed, uncelebrated, but ready. History rarely remembers the quiet ones. It favors the beasts that thunder, the jaws that snap, the skeletons that stretch across museum halls. But in the Permian, survival was not loud. It didn't roar. It clicked, hissed, and slipped between stones. And when the dust settled, when the last of the swamp kings fell and the air ran thin, it was the quiet ones who remained. Their victory was not a conquest. It was an inheritance. What they inherited was a world still in flux, a planet still bleeding from the loss of its forests, still shifting under the pressure of supercontinents forming and seas withdrawing. Oxygen had dropped. Carbon had risen. Rain fell less often, and when it did, it came hard. But these survivors were ready, because they had never depended on abundance. Their lungs didn't need rich air. Their eggs didn't need puddles. Their limbs didn't need soggy floors. They were creatures of the dry, creatures of the brittle, creatures of the edge, and edges, when held long enough, become centers. In time, the world would recover, but it would not be the same world. Gone were the Carboniferous coal swamps, the cathedral forests of scale trees and giant ferns. In their place came scrublands, conifer forests, hardier flora that could endure long dry seasons. With this change came new opportunities, and the reptiles, already light, efficient, and independent, moved in to take them. Among them, the synapsids would continue to diversify, some of them beginning to show proto-mammalian traits, whisker pits, complex teeth, a hint of warm-blooded metabolism. Others would begin to fade. Diapsids, too, were quietly expanding, some evolving into agile predators, others into herbivores, some into forms that would one day stretch wings of skin or feather. It wasn't an explosion. It was a long, slow burn, but it was the burn that shaped the Mesozoic. Every dinosaur, every bird, every mammal, even you, owes something to this moment, to these eggs that didn't dry out, to these lungs that didn't fail, to these small creatures that kept breathing when the giants fell silent. Because life doesn't just survive extinction by luck, it survives by design, and the designs that worked in low oxygen, in shifting climates, in sparse lands, those were the ones that carved the path forward. This is what the Permian gifted the future. Not dominance, but design. Not noise, but persistence. Not giants, but the genes that would one day dream of flight. Even now, you carry echoes of it. Your lungs are descended from theirs. Your heart, too. Your need for air, your warmth, your fragility, they all trace back to those who won not by fighting but by waiting. Not by growing large, but by staying alive. This chapter ends not in extinction, but in transition, and in that quiet transition, evolution planted its most resilient seeds. The kind that would bloom again, louder, larger, stranger in the next world to come. But before we move forward, we must return underground. Beneath our feet lie stories too small to see, but too vast to ignore. In seams of ancient coal, pressed under millions of years of heat and pressure, is the memory of a world lost not just in life, but in atmosphere, in fire, in breath. This chapter is not about the creatures that walked or crawled above the soil. It is about the shadows they left behind, locked in carbon, laced with ash, waiting, because coal is not just fuel, it is fossilized time. Each layer holds the debris of forests, once tall and tangled ferns, lycopsids, horsetails, club mosses flattened, buried, and transformed into a material that still burns in our fires today. We mine it for power, but in doing so, we excavate history. Compressed leaf tissue, flattened bark, and ghostly root structures swirl through its matrix like echoes. And when cut, sliced, and studied under microscopes, these seams reveal not just what grew but how the world breathed while it did. Coal begins in a bog, a place where plant matter accumulates faster than it decays, where water saturates the ground, sealing oxygen out and locking organic material in. Over time, these bogs become peat beds. With burial, pressure, and heat, that peat transforms first to lignite, then bituminous coal, then to anthracite. Each step loses water, gains carbon, and compresses memory. But it also records fingerprints, pollen grains, spore walls, even microscopic charcoal. Through radiometric dating and stratigraphic correlation, scientists can place these layers in time. We can track changes in dominant plant types, see how ferns gave way to seed-bearing species, watch the rise of conifers. In some samples, you can even see seasonal changes, rings of growth, and decay etched like tree rings in microscopic debris. And between these layers, you find the black streaks, charcoal, pure carbon, baked by flame, left behind by wildfires fierce enough to sear the canopy and leave no survivors. These aren't rare. In Carboniferous coal seams, they're common, so common in fact that they've become one of the most powerful proxies for understanding prehistoric fire. Because for a forest to burn, three things must exist: fuel, ignition, and oxygen. The swamps had the fuel, lightning supplied the ignition, but the real enabler, the one that turned these fires from flickers into infernos, was the air itself. This was an Earth with 35% oxygen. A planet where a spark could ignite damp wood, where flames climbed into treetops, jumped rivers, and scarred continents. And when those fires died, the charcoal settled, layering into future coal seams as black lines of combustion, a fossilized signature of atmospheric overdrive. Coal, then, is not just carbon. It's caution, a record of a world that once burned too easily, and a warning for those who would burn it again. Because when you hold coal in your hand, you are holding the memory of flame, and that flame never forgets. Hold a lump of coal to the light, and it tells you nothing. It is matte, dark, silent. But place a thin slice of it under a microscope, and the silence breaks. Suddenly, you're not looking at stone. You're looking at time in suspension. There are cells here, membranes, microfibers of ancient xylem and phloem, walls of once-living tissue, perfectly flattened but intact, like pressed flowers between the pages of the earth. And among them, millions upon millions of spores and grains of pollen, specks of reproductive ambition from plants that no longer exist. This is the secret language of coal. Botanists and paleontologists call this field palynology, the study of ancient pollen and spores, but it is more than a field. It is a map, because these microscopic bodies are tough, chemically resilient against time and pressure. Even when the wood around them is crushed to oblivion, the spores persist, fossilized like tiny seeds of data, and they are everywhere. Each coal seam contains its own signature pollen blend. Different layers yield different species, proof of slow ecological shifts over millennia. Some seams are dominated by Lycospora spores from towering club mosses. Others hold more punctatisporites, levigatossporites, or florinites, each tied to a different forest makeup, different swamp chemistry, different moment in time. And by reading these spores, we can reconstruct whole landscapes. We know which plants preferred wetter climates, which ones thrived in acidic bogs, which ones declined as oxygen fell and the world dried. We can even spot mass extinction events by the sudden disappearance of dominant spore types replaced by new, opportunistic species that rush to fill the vacuum. It's like reading a forest's obituary through its pollen. But the record isn't only about death. It also shows us the resilience of life. How ferns survived the collapse, how seed ferns began to rise, how early conifers crept in, better adapted to dry, open ground. These shifts didn't happen overnight. They took tens of thousands of years, but in the compressed lens of the fossil record, they are sudden and telling. Some pollen grains are spiky, made for wind dispersal. Others are sticky, adapted to insect pollination. This tells us about the forest's air, its ecology, its relationships. Even when we can't see the insects themselves, we see the adaptations that imply them. The pollen, in this way, becomes a shadow of interaction, a memory of motion. What's more, we can track charcoal alongside pollen. Layer by layer, we can correlate surges in wildfires with declines in specific plant groups. Some species vanish right after high charcoal layers. Others explode in abundance, adapted to fire-scoured ground. The rhythm of fire and regrowth is written clearly if you know how to listen. And listening to coal is like listening to a forest that no longer has a voice. It speaks in grains, in ghosts, in the residue of breath, long gone, but not erased. Fire has no skeleton, it leaves no bones, no shell, no flesh to fossilize. But fire remembers, and its memory is charcoal. You can hold it, weigh it, slice it into sections, stain it, scan it, and place it under magnification. What you'll see isn't ash. It's cellular architecture, perfectly preserved, perfectly blackened, turned into glassy carbon by temperatures high enough to arrest decay, but low enough to preserve form. This is what wildfire leaves behind. And in the coal seams of the Carboniferous and Permian, charcoal is everywhere. To the naked eye, it's a thin black stripe, sometimes less than a centimeter thick. But under a microscope, it's a revelation. Charred wood fragments, blistered leaf veins, even microbially scarred tissues frozen in the moment of burning. These layers are time-stamped disasters. They speak of ancient forests that ignited and fell, again and again, under skies that gave flame more breath than we would dare to imagine. Because in a world with 35% atmospheric oxygen, the rules of fire changed. Modern Earth's atmosphere contains just 21% oxygen. Even then, wildfires can devastate landscapes, jump rivers, consume cities. But at 30%, 35%? Fire doesn't just start more easily. It spreads with terrifying speed. It consumes damp wood. It climbs living trees. It doesn't flicker. It races. It roars. Experimental studies in controlled laboratories have tested this. Wood samples that smolder in modern air ignite instantly in elevated oxygen conditions. Even wet plant matter can combust. Lightning strikes aren't required. Mere heat, friction, or sunlight through a raindrop could be enough. This was not a planet that feared fire. It was a planet shaped by it, and it left that shape in coal. High-resolution stratigraphy lets researchers identify dozens, sometimes hundreds of discrete charcoal layers within a single deposit. Each layer tells of a fire event, its intensity, its timing, and its ecological aftermath. In some coal beds, the charcoal forms a repeating rhythm, indicating not just random ignition, but seasonal fire regimes. There were fire seasons even then. Just as modern Australia and California burn on cue, so too did vast swathes of the Carboniferous tropics. The presence of microscopic charcoal across such a wide geographic and temporal range suggests that fire was not rare, not regional, but systemic. It was a global pattern. And more than that, it was self-reinforcing. Fire cleared space for fast-growing ferns and seed plants. These new colonizers produced more flammable litter. That litter dried under open canopies, feeding the next blaze. A feedback loop emerged. Fire created landscapes primed for more fire, and with so much oxygen in the air, the cycle didn't need much encouragement. This was not the age of ice, it was the age of ignition. But fire wasn't just a destroyer, it also played a role in coal formation itself. When fire consumed the surface vegetation, it often left behind deeply charred residues, materials resistant to bacterial decay. These charred remnants would become incorporated into peat. The very process of burning, paradoxically, helped preserve carbon. Fire locked it in. So when we burn coal today, we are not only releasing ancient plant matter, we are burning ancient fire. We are reigniting blazes that flickered out 300 million years ago, under skies none of us could survive in, and the charcoal still remembers. It speaks, not in smoke, but in silence. In carbon signatures, in fragmentary embers, in the language of loss and atmosphere. To understand the breath of the past, scientists listen to carbon. Not just any carbon, but specific forms, ratios, and residues. In the black veins of ancient coal seams, charcoal offers more than a story of fire. It offers a gauge, a dial, a record of just how oxygen-rich Earth's atmosphere once was. Because fire needs oxygen to burn, and not just a little. Below 16%, flames sputter. Below 13%, they vanish entirely. Our modern world, with its 21% atmospheric oxygen, walks a tightrope enough for life, enough for fire, but not enough for every forest to become a fuse. But coal-age Earth, it was different. Researchers now believe atmospheric oxygen during the late Carboniferous and early Permian may have peaked at 35%, a full 2/3 more than today. That estimate doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from charcoal. Here's how it works. In laboratory conditions, scientists combust plant material at varying oxygen levels. They observe at what concentrations ignition occurs, how fast flames spread, and how much charcoal is produced. These experiments produce a kind of calibration curve of fire, thermometer of sorts. Then, they compare that curve to fossil charcoal layers in coal seams. The volume, structure, and distribution of charcoal fragments offer clues. Was the fire intense or mild? Surface level or canopy? Burning? Frequent or rare? When the charcoal is abundant, widespread, and composed of fully preserved anatomical detail, it points to high oxygen conditions that allowed for hot, rapid combustion. It's not just that there's charcoal, it's the kind of charcoal, the thickness of cell walls, the presence of unburned spores nearby, the chemistry of the carbon itself. All of it folds into a wider picture, one where fire was a reliable tool for estimating oxygen. But oxygen doesn't just rise on its own. There's a reason for the Carboniferous spike, and that reason is buried carbon. As lush forests grew and fell in an oxygen-rich world, much of their biomass was buried before it could rot, especially in the anoxic, waterlogged conditions of swamps. This trapped the carbon in sediment, pulling it out of the atmosphere. When carbon dioxide drops and burial accelerates, oxygen rises. And when those buried forests became coal, they recorded the peak. But this high point didn't last. As conditions changed, swamps dried, continents shifted, and new forms of decay evolved, the burial rate slowed. More carbon remained in circulation. Oxygen began to fall, and the charcoal record thinned. Fires became rarer, less intense. The skies, once so easy to ignite, grew harder to burn. The coal seams reflect this too. Later deposits show fewer fire layers. The preserved pollen begins to shift toward plants that favor drier, more open environments. Even the types of insects and amphibians fossilized alongside these layers begin to change, adapting to a cooler, less flammable world. In this way, charcoal is more than a residue. It's a barometer of atmosphere, a measure of breath, and, in the end, a map of how Earth once exhaled too freely and slowly learned restraint. Coal is not just a rock. It is a graveyard, a library, a compression of time, temperature, and photosynthesis into something deceptively ordinary, something black and dusty that we shovel, burn, and monetize, rarely stopping to consider what exactly we're setting on fire. Because coal is fossilized sunlight, it's the energy of a carboniferous sun stored inside the bodies of trees that fell before flowers, before birds, before mammals drew their first breath. And within it is the chemistry of a world that breathed differently. A world where oxygen soared, fires danced unchecked, and insects ruled the air like birds of bone and chitin. When we ignite coal today, we do more than release heat. We release atmosphere. we undo burial. We take the carbon that once triggered a planetary oxygen high and return it to the sky, not over millennia, but over minutes. In doing so, we reverse a process that took nature tens of millions of years to balance. We disturb a system that, once, nearly burned itself alive. That story is written in every seam. Every black ribbon of coal that cuts through sandstone and shale is a message from the deep past. It says, once, there were forests vast enough to reshape the sky. Once, there were fires strong enough to leave shadows that still whisper. Once, there was breath too rich to last, and then it fell. The oxygen bubble collapsed. The giants died. The world cooled, dried, moved on. But the carbon remained, buried, waiting for us. And now, we dig it up. We treat coal as resource, not warning. We burn it for electricity, smelt with it, forge with it, illuminate with it. And in doing so, we reawaken not just its energy, but its implications. Today, coal combustion is one of the single largest contributors to rising atmospheric CO2s. It acidifies oceans. It shifts climates. It carries, silently, the memory of overabundance and imbalance. The past is not passive. It fights to be remembered. And coal fights with flame. When we peer into its structure, microscope pressed to slice, glint of carbon sharp under lamplight, we are peering into a story of excess, of ecosystems that flourished too fast, of fires that fed on air too rich, of life that flew too close to its own limit. It's tempting to think coal is spent history, a closed chapter, but it isn't. We're still in it. We are the species that reads coal's warnings and chooses to strike the match anyway. We are built from the survivors of oxygen's fall, yet we caught its mirror mistake, carbon's rise. In the end, coal isn't just what we burn, it's what we learn from. If we're wise, we'll listen. If we're reckless, we'll repeat. And if we're something in between, as most species are, then perhaps, one day, we'll leave behind our own seams. Not of coal, but of consequence. The next layer, pressed into earth, waiting to speak. But what if we zoom out, not just across continents or epochs, but across hundreds of millions of years? What if we track oxygen not as a local phenomenon, but as a planetary breath? Because that's what it island. Earth inhales and exhales, slowly, relentlessly, and the consequences ripple through every cell, every forest, every extinction. This is the story of the long oxygen cycle. Not the oxygen in your lungs today, but the atmospheric oxygen, the stuff that wraps the planet in an invisible veil of possibility or constraint. The ratio that defines how high a flame can leap, how deep blood can carry energy, how large life can grow. It's easy to think of that number 21% as fixed, stable. But it isn't. It never has been. Oxygen fluctuates. It rises, it falls, and it leaves traces. In coal seams, in ice cores, in rusted rocks, in the shape of skeletons and the width of tree rings. For decades, scientists have worked to reconstruct this atmospheric heartbeat. And one of their most powerful tools is a model called GeoCarbSulf. It sounds like a spaceship. It's not. GeoCarbSulf is a computer model, an integration of geological, chemical, and biological processes that simulates changes in atmospheric CO2s, O2, and sulfur over the past 600 million years. It weaves together data from ancient soils, sediment cores, fossil fuels, and isotope ratios, and when you run the numbers, a pattern emerges. Oxygen has spiked, and oxygen has crashed. The Carboniferous, as we've seen, was one such spike, an era of lush burial and high flame. But later, in the Permian and Triassic, oxygen levels plummeted. Some estimates suggest dips to as low as 15%. In the Devonian, another drop. During the Cambrian explosion, a rise. And near the end, Cretaceous, when dinosaurs vanished, a sharp, chaotic seesaw. Each change left scars. Mass extinctions correlate eerily with some of these shifts. Not all, but enough to suggest a dangerous intimacy. Because oxygen isn't just about fire, it's about blood, metabolism, recovery. When oxygen falls too fast, ecosystems falter. Recovery slows. Predators weaken. Scavengers thrive. It's not just who dies, it's who can survive in a thinner world. The breath of the planet shapes its pulse, and that pulse isn't regular. It's modulated by feedback loops, some vast, some intimate. Forests grow and draw down CO2, which cools the earth and raises O2. Fires burn those forests, adding carbon back. Erosion of rocks locks carbon away again. Life creates oxygen, but oxygen also enables life to grow larger and thus store or release more carbon in turn. It's not a line, it's a loop, a living feedback system between rock, fire, breath, and time. In the next segment, we'll follow these loops into the deep earth and the upper sky to see how volcanism, erosion, and even plate tectonics breathe with the same invisible lungs. Because Earth is not just alive with life, it's alive with breath. The Earth breathes in loops, but sometimes that breath falters, it stutters, collapses, and when it does, life suffers. Mass extinctions are the punctuation marks of prehistory. They end eras, erase ecosystems, leave behind empty niches, vacant skies, and bones without successors. We often think of them in terms of impact events or volcanism, and those forces matter. But look closer, and you'll often find oxygen in the margins. Because when oxygen drops, life slows. Its metabolism constricts. Its energy yields weaken. Predators lose their edge. Recovery from catastrophe becomes less about adaptation and more about endurance. Entire classes of animals, once dominant, are outpaced by creatures that can live on less. Take the Permian Triassic extinction, 252 million years ago. It was the worst the planet has ever known. Over 90% of marine species gone. More than 70% of terrestrial vertebrates extinguished. What caused it? The evidence points to massive volcanic eruptions in Siberia, flood basalts that poured carbon dioxide into the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. Temperatures soared. Oceans acidified. But hidden in that chain of events was another shift, a crash in atmospheric oxygen. Estimates suggest a drop from 30% to below 15% in under 1 million years. That doesn't just mean fire suppression, it means suffocation. Shallow seas turned anoxic poisonous to fish, plankton, coral. Even on land, animals with high oxygen demands like large therapsids struggled to maintain energy. Those that survived were often small, low-metabolism generalists. Evolution doesn't reward strength in thin air. It rewards economy. A similar pattern played out after the Devonian extinction, and again in the Triassic-Jurassic event. In each case, sharp disruptions in oxygen coincide with ecological upheaval. Sometimes it's fire that disappears. Other times it's the size and speed of animals that change. The message is always the same. Oxygen is not background. It is active. It decides. Even marine life, often buffered by water chemistry, is not immune. In low oxygen oceans, known as oceanic anoxic events, OAEs, entire food chains collapse. Phytoplankton die. Oxygen-hungry species flee to shallows or perish. Bottom feeders vanish, and the sediment layers laid down during these times are black, rich in organic matter, lacking the rust-red tones of oxygenated decay. Oxygen leaves signatures in stone, and silence in ecosystems. But it also sets the stage for what's next. After each fall, oxygen eventually rises again. Life rebounds. Not the same life, but new forms, adapted to the altered air. With more efficient lungs, with stronger hearts, with innovations that allow energy to flow even in constraint. Evolution is opportunistic, but it's also reactive. The fall of one regime creates space for the next. So mass extinctions aren't just ends, they are breathless intervals, pauses in a larger respiration. And when oxygen returns, so too does complexity. We'll uncover the feedback loops between fire, erosion, minerals, and biology that keep this planetary breath cycling, and sometimes spiraling, because what goes out must come back in, but not always in the same form, and not always on the same time scale. The planet's breath is not a metronome. It's not even a pendulum. It is a web of feedback loops, some fast, some slow, some visible, some buried deep within the crust. And they all whisper to the atmosphere, tugging its oxygen up or down over eons. Let's trace one of these loops. It begins with plants. Photosynthesis splits water molecules and uses carbon dioxide to produce sugars and oxygen. On land, this oxygen is released directly into the air. In the oceans, it bubbles through surface layers and supports vast microbial networks. But not all oxygen makes it into the long-term record. Most of it is reabsorbed, consumed by microbes, burned in respiration, or bound to decaying matter. Only when carbon is buried does oxygen truly rise. That's the trade. The two are linked. Carbon buried in sediments, oxygen added to the air. That's why the Carboniferous saw such a dramatic oxygen spike. Dense forests, vast swamps, and low microbial decomposition meant more plant carbon was trapped underground. The carbon stayed put. The oxygen did not. But burial isn't passive. It needs erosion. Rain falls, rocks wear down, nutrients flow into the sea. These nutrients, especially phosphorus and iron, fertilize plankton blooms. More plankton means more photosynthesis, more carbon fixation, and, again, more potential burial. The loop continues. Rock feeds sea feeds sky, and then there's fire. Fire is a predator of forests, but it's also a gatekeeper. In high oxygen worlds, fire becomes rampant, clearing undergrowth and creating openings for new growth. In some cases, it can enhance carbon burial by generating charcoal carbon-rich material resistant to decay. This charcoal, if buried, acts like a battery. Locked carbon equals liberated oxygen, but fire also consumes oxygen. Too much fire, too often, begins to neutralize its own benefit. It's a tightrope, a balancing act that forests, climates, and lightning systems have navigated together for hundreds of millions of years. There are negative feedback loops that dampen change. As oxygen rises, fires become more frequent. Those fires limit forest density. Less forest equals less photosynthesis, equals slower oxygen increase. The system reins itself in, and there are positive feedback loops that accelerate change. If erosion increases, it feeds the ocean with more nutrients. More nutrients fuel more plankton. More plankton leads to more burial. More burial means more oxygen. The planet breathes deeper. And then there are wild cards, like volcanic eruptions, a supercontinent forming and blocking ocean currents. A sudden evolution, say. The rise of lignin-degrading fungi during the Permian that allows decay to resume in once-resistant woody tissues. These events disrupt the loops. They tip balances. Sometimes gently, sometimes with extinction, but the loops continue. And the planet never stops negotiating with itself. The air you're breathing now, the 21% oxygen that supports your thoughts, your muscles, your heartbeat, isn't an accident. It's the result of thousands of such loops, tugging in different directions, settling into a dynamic equilibrium. Not a perfect balance. A live balance. One that sways, trembles, and on geological timescales occasionally shatters. Earth's atmosphere is alive, but it's not invincible. We are no longer just passengers in the cycle. For most of Earth's history, oxygen was shaped by mountains rising, continents colliding, forests spreading, and time passing. Change came slowly, too slowly, for any single creature to notice. But that was before industry, before combustion engines, before one species discovered how to light the ancient past on fire. Now, we're pulling at the loops ourselves. We burn coal forged from Carboniferous swamps. We flare methane from seabeds. We release carbon stored for hundreds of millions of years. And in doing so, we alter the balance that once allowed oxygen to rise. We're not just adding CO2, we're disturbing the very feedbacks that held the air in place. The numbers haven't plunged. Not yet. Oxygen is still around 21% of the atmosphere. But that number hides deeper changes. Oceans, warmed by excess heat, hold less dissolved gas. Coastal waters, overrun with runoff, spawn dead zones, oxygen-poor basins where fish and plankton die in the tens of thousands. On land, forests burn more often and regrow less efficiently. Insects shift ranges. Coral reefs smother. Amphibians vanish. Life feels it. Because life is tuned to a breath, it didn't choose but one it depends on. The oxygen cycle is delicate, not because oxygen is scarce, but because the systems that sustain it are vulnerable. The forests that exhale, the algae that bubble, the soil that filters these aren't permanent fixtures. They are processes, and we are accelerating their disruption. Feedback loops don't care about intent. They respond to input. Increase carbon, the planet heats. Warm the seas, plankton die. Kill the plankton, less photosynthesis, less burial. Less oxygen stability. Strip forests, less carbon sink. More wildfires, more particulates in the air, more damage to the lungs of Earth. It spirals, not all at once, but fast enough to matter, and there's a cruel irony. The same oxygen-rich coal that once turned swamps into flame and flame into atmospheric abundance now returns as exhaust. What was once the cause of oxygenation has become the agent of depletion. We are undoing the burial that built the world we know. There are warnings in this. The Permian saw a drop in oxygen and a collapse in biodiversity. The oceans went still. Forests vanished. Recovery took tens of millions of years. Today, the threat may not be as dramatic, but it is more complex. Faster. Interwoven with other systems. Climate, chemistry, ecology, and the speed is everything. Life can adapt to change, but not all life can adapt to fast change, and never before has a single species held so much sway over the air. We carry oxygen with us in tanks to climb Everest, to fly at altitude, to dive below the surface, but we forget that we did not build the system that lets us breathe. We inherited it, and like all inheritances, it can be spent. We are still breathing what ancient forests gave us, but the loops are tightening, and the air, though invisible, remembers everything. Step outside, breathe in. That breath isn't just air, it's inheritance. A trace of forests that no longer stand, oceans that no longer ripple, fungi that once cracked the code of lignin. It's a chemical signature etched by algae, by storms, by wildfire, by decay. You carry the story of oxygen in your blood. Every heartbeat confirms it. We don't think about it because we don't have to. But Earth has been many things, and it has not always been breathable. There were times when oxygen was scarce, when simple animals could not yet extract enough energy to move, to hunt, to think. There were eras when it surged, when insects became giants and fire danced across continents with abandon. There were crashes, recoveries, and balances struck between life and death. And through it all, the planet kept breathing, not always in rhythm, not always gently, but consistently enough to cradle evolution, to permit flight, to allow blood, to give rise to animals who could ask questions like these. The oxygen in our atmosphere is not magic. It is memory. It remembers burial. It remembers erosion. It remembers rain that fell on stone and washed nutrients into seas. It remembers every feedback loop, every push and pull between what was alive and what was lost. Even now, every fossil we unearth speaks to that balance, not just in form, but in chemistry. In charcoaled veins, in oxidized iron, we live in a thin, fragile moment, a pocket of time where oxygen is just right, where fire is possible but not omnipresent, where we can breathe without gills, without tanks, without fear. That moment was bought not by design, but by accident, by the long dance of life and rock and time. And we are rewriting it, not necessarily with malice, but with momentum. We have shifted the balance of carbon, of climate, of chemistry, and the breath is beginning to change. Not enough to choke us, yet, but enough that corals dim, forests burn, and creatures struggle to keep up with what we no longer see. The sky remains blue, but beneath it, the system strains. And so, the story of oxygen becomes a mirror. It reflects our past, how life sculpted the air. It reflects our present, how we live inside its gift. And it reflects a future that has not yet been written. A future shaped not only by what we burn, but by what we remember. Because breath is not just biology, it is awareness. The awareness that we are not separate from the atmosphere. We are its children, its dependents, its storytellers. Every lungful we draw is a line in a poem that began 4 billion years ago. To forget that is not just to lose knowledge, it is to lose connection. We inherit not only lungs and blood, but responsibility. The air that shaped us now responds to our actions, not because it wants to, but because it must. The system is sensitive, responsive, and alive in ways we still struggle to fully grasp. It ends, perhaps, not with a silence, but with a question. What kind of ancestors will we be to the next breath? Legacy is not always a blessing. The same air that lifts birds into flight and fuels the fires of metabolism can also destroy. Oxygen, for all its generosity, is not a passive presence. It is a force, a chemical with teeth. And when it rises too far above balance, it becomes something else entirely, something unruly, something dangerous. This is the paradox at the heart of Earth's history. The very gas that made complex life possible also made the world more fragile. For years, we've celebrated the high-oxygen world of the Carboniferous as a paradise of growth. Insects stretched skyward, amphibians lumbered across root-latticed swamps. Fires burned hot and bright. But the truth is less romantic, more combustible, because oxygen at high enough levels stops being a gift and starts being a hazard. It begins inside the body. Oxygen isn't just a fuel for life. It's a reactive substance. Every breath we take carries with it a risk. At 21%, our current atmospheric concentration oxygen dances carefully with our biochemistry. It powers cellular respiration without too much collateral damage. But push that number to 30%, 35% or more, and oxygen becomes overzealous. It tears into tissues, it oxidizes metals, it sparks chain reactions inside cells. This is oxygen toxicity. It affects animals differently. For humans, it's why scuba divers breathe special gas mixes at depth. Pure oxygen, under pressure, can cause seizures, lung damage, or blindness. In lab rats, high oxygen levels lead to inflammation, enzyme disruption, and early death. Even in insects, those giants of the Carboniferous, there were limits. Physiologically, more oxygen sounds like a performance boost, and for a time, it was. Bigger wings, stronger muscles, faster metabolisms. But those benefits came at a cost: greater vulnerability to damage, more oxidative stress, shorter lifespans. In some species, rapid development meant fragile biology. The giants weren't just larger, they were more flammable from the inside out. Because oxygen doesn't know when to stop, it floods tissues, it erodes membranes, it creates free radicals, unstable molecules that shred DNA, proteins, lipids. And without antioxidants or internal controls, those radicals can unravel entire systems. Even today, oxidative stress is linked to aging, cancer, neurodegeneration. It is, in some ways, the price we pay for being aerobic. Now imagine a whole planet leaning too far in that direction. High atmospheric oxygen didn't just elevate metabolism. It amplified vulnerability. The line between thriving and burning became razor thin. Forests grew lush, but ignited with a spark. Insects flew far but were biologically volatile. Life expanded and reached a ceiling shaped by the very thing it depended on. Too much of a good thing, weaponized by time. The irony is haunting. We often long for abundance, more air, more growth, more energy. But evolution, over time, tells a different story. That survival belongs not to the largest, nor to the most oxygen, rich but to the most adaptable, to those who learned how to live not in excess, but in balance, because the cost of abundance isn't paid in fire alone. Sometimes it's paid in silence. In extinction, in the thinning of wings and the shortening of breaths, in learning too late that even breath has limits. The trees didn't fall, they burned. With every percentage point rise in atmospheric oxygen, the rules of combustion shifted. Flames no longer needed dry brush or perfect weather. A single lightning strike, common in Earth's stormy Carboniferous skies, could ignite a forest still damp from rain. Leaves hissed, bark blistered, and entire ecosystems went up in waves of light. High oxygen levels didn't just feed life, they fed fire. Modern Earth teaches us the limits of flammability. Our 21% oxygen atmosphere requires dry fuel and the right conditions. Forests burn seasonally, when droughts linger or winds gather. But at 30-35% oxygen, as some models suggest once existed, everything becomes fuel. Moist logs, living plants. Even soil-rich litter layers that would smolder today burned brightly in the past. We know this not through guesswork, but through charcoal. Charcoal is the residue of incomplete combustion. It forms when plant matter burns hot, but is quickly buried, preserved, rather than consumed. And in the rock record, charcoal tells a story that's hard to ignore. The Carboniferous and early Permian are rich with it. Black streaks in sedimentary layers mark ancient fire horizons, fossilized reminders that fire was not an exception. It was a season. We also find burn scars on fossil wood. Tree trunks preserved in ancient swamp beds show signs of scorching, then regrowth, then scorching again. This wasn't a one-off event, it was a rhythm, a pattern. Forests adapted to survive burning. Some plants even developed traits we now associate with fire resilience. Thick bark, deep root systems, spore-based regrowth. Traits born in a world where combustion was part of the climate. But not everything could keep up. Fires didn't just consume trees. They reset habitats. They stripped canopies, exposed soil, drained swamps. Insects dependent on specific vegetation vanished. Amphibians that relied on wet, shaded environments found themselves scorched or stranded. When entire landscapes burned, food webs collapsed and recovery took decades, sometimes longer. This volatility didn't just shape biology, it shaped atmosphere. Fires release carbon dioxide and aerosols. In massive quantities, they alter climate patterns, cool the air, seed clouds, acidify rain. In an already oxygen-rich world, runaway fire events could feed a feedback loop. More burning, more carbon in the air, more instability, more ecological turnover, and eventually, collapse. It may be why oxygen never stayed at those highs. Fire may have been the planet's own regulator. Too much oxygen? More fire. More fire? Less vegetation? Less vegetation? Less oxygen produced. The system bent, flared, and then corrected. Not by choice, but by chemistry. Life's overreach triggered its own rebalancing. The ceiling of abundance, enforced by flame. It's easy to see oxygen as a gift, and it island. But in excess, it made Earth a wick waiting for a match, and the match never stopped striking. The same molecule that let life breathe also lit the fuse. Eventually, the giants began to shrink. It wasn't a single extinction, not a sudden collapse, but a retreat, a drawing back from the edge of abundance. As oxygen levels dipped slowly, unevenly, so too did the size and metabolism of the creatures that had once ruled the skies and swamps. Evolution responded, not with protest, but with pragmatism. Organisms didn't choose to be smaller, but those that could survive in lower oxygen, those with more efficient respiration, more flexible metabolisms, and lower energy demands, thrived when the air changed. As the atmosphere rebalanced, so did life's priorities. Insects were the first to feel it. Their breathing systems, open tracheal tubes rather than lungs, depend entirely on diffusion. No pumping heart moves air, only proximity to oxygen. Rich airways allows gas to enter tissues. In a 35% oxygen world, even giant insects could passively receive enough to fuel flight. But as oxygen dropped, diffusion limits became more pronounced. The math changed. Bigger no longer worked. Smaller insects could still fly. Bigger ones could not. And so they vanished. We see this in the fossil record. After the Carboniferous, the truly enormous insects like the hawk-sized Meganeura disappear. By the Permian, wing lengths are shorter, body masses are reduced. And what fills the gap isn't extinction, but adaptation. New ecological roles arise. Insects diversify, but they don't return to their former size. Even in vertebrates, the pattern holds. Amphibians once reached lengths of 3 meters. Their lungs were simple sacs, not efficient, but enough in oxygen-rich air. As that air thinned, so did their dominance. Reptiles rose. They carried an innovation, more developed lungs, better suited to low-oxygen environments. And with them came the amniotic egg, letting life reproduce away from water. Another form of moderation, separation from dependence. It was as if evolution had learned a lesson. Oxygen excess created possibility, but it also created fragility. And fragility doesn't last. Not in fires, not in droughts, not in shifting climates. So evolution began favoring systems that could endure variability, not abundance. We see this in oxygen tolerance curves. Species that evolved later, during or after oxygen decline tend to survive in wider atmospheric ranges. They show better responses to hypoxia, more control over respiration, lower metabolic peaks, but greater sustainability. In other words, they learned how to survive the lows, not just thrive in the highs. This is a kind of wisdom. The forest that doesn't burn hottest may last longest. The species that breathes more slowly may outlive those that blaze and fall. Evolution has no brain, but across millions of years, it records consequence in bones, in cells, in the narrowing gap between breath and burn. And so, moderation becomes a survival trait, not a weakness, not a regression, a strategy, because in a world where too much of anything can kill you, balance isn't just healthy, it's necessary. And for life on Earth, the lesson was branded in flame, fossils, and ash. Sometimes the cost of abundance is learning when to step back. What once happened on a planetary scale now plays out in hospital rooms, mountaintops, and laboratories. We live in a world that no longer burns so easily, but we still carry the echoes of a world that did. The relationship between oxygen and life didn't vanish when atmospheric levels fell. It became encoded in our physiology, and sometimes it resurfaces in ways that are strangely familiar. Consider modern oxygen therapy. In medicine, oxygen is a tool. We give it to premature infants whose lungs haven't fully developed, to climbers suffering from altitude sickness, to the elderly with failing respiratory systems. It feels like healing, restoring breath, relieving strain, but use too much, and the danger returns. Oxygen toxicity is real. Prolonged exposure to high concentrations can damage lungs, inflame tissue, and even lead to seizures. In neonatal wards, infants once went blind because incubators were oversaturated with oxygen. In deep-sea diving, a pure oxygen tank at the wrong pressure becomes a neurotoxic weapon. What ancient insects tolerated Modern mammals cannot, because our bodies are not built for abundance. They are tuned for moderation. Even our athletic limits show it. At high altitude, say, above 500 meters, oxygen levels drop significantly. The air becomes thin and performance declines. Blood oxygen saturation falls, muscles fatigue faster, brains work slower. At the extreme edge, in the death zone above 0 meters, humans begin to deteriorate just by being there. Without supplemental oxygen, death is a matter of time. These limits aren't just discomfort. They are reminders of how finely tuned we are to Earth's current atmospheric window, how easily our biology falters when that window narrows or widens. But some creatures adapted differently. The bar-headed goose, for example, migrates over the Himalayas. It can fly at altitudes exceeding 0 meters, where oxygen is scarce. How? By evolving hemoglobin that binds oxygen more tightly than ours. Tibetan humans, too, have adaptations, not more red blood cells, like lowlanders, but better oxygen delivery. Their bodies don't just endure hypoxia, they've re-engineered the system. And then there's the other end of the spectrum. Creatures that thrive in high oxygen environments. Not in the wild, those no longer exist, but in controlled labs, where researchers test how insects respond to elevated oxygen. Some grow faster, some get larger, but nearly all face an upper limit, beyond which damage outweighs growth. This is where modern science mirrors ancient history. We are watching evolution's old experiments replayed under glass, and the verdict remains: bigger isn't always better. More oxygen doesn't mean more life, it means more risk. A narrower edge to walk, a tighter balance to maintain. The same rules that once governed the Carboniferous still echo in every breath we take. Every medical oxygen tank, every summit attempt on Everest. Nature remembers. Even when we forget, the lungs, the blood, the very enzymes that carry oxygen through our cells still reflect a truth learned long ago. Abundance, unchecked, carries a price. And every time we push past that line, whether in search of performance, healing, or conquest, we're playing with the same fire the Earth once knew too well. It's easy to romanticize the age of giants. To imagine dragonflies like hawks drifting through sunlit forests. To walk among millipedes as long as beds, beneath tree ferns tall as buildings, in air thick enough to ignite with a spark. There is wonder in that world, yes. But wonder often walks with danger. The cost of abundance wasn't paid all at once. It accumulated. In fragile lungs, in flammable bark, in ecosystems stretched taut like string. Oxygen gave, but always with conditions. You could grow if you could survive the fire. You could fly if your body didn't burn too brightly from the inside. You could rule if you were ready to fall when the balance shifted, and shift it did. The giants fell. Not because they failed, but because their world became unsustainable. Oxygen dropped. Swamps dried. Feedback loops broke. And evolution, blind, patient, relentless, took a new turn. Toward smaller, toward safer, toward life that didn't burn quite so easily. Moderation, it turns out, isn't just a compromise. It's a strategy, a form of resilience, a way to survive long enough to matter. It's what allowed reptiles to thrive when amphibians faltered. What let mammals endure in shadows while dinosaurs roared. What kept the oxygen of our own era stable enough for thought, culture, cities. Not a perfect system, but a survivable one. And so the story of oxygen isn't just about fire or flight. It's about tension between growth and risk, between potential and collapse, between the dream of more and the wisdom of enough. That tension still exists. In our fuels, in our factories, in our forests, we pump the buried breath of ancient life into the sky again. Carbon rises, temperatures shift, wildfires rage with new intensity. We are not returning to the Carboniferous, but we are flirting, once more, with atmospheric change, with the edge of balance. The past doesn't predict the future, but it does warn. It reminds us that Earth's chemistry is not fixed, that abundance can become instability, that the very thing that gave us life, oxygen, can also take it away. So, next time you hear the word more, ask yourself, at what cost? Because the giants didn't fall in silence, they left us their outline. In shale, in coal, in charred layers of Earth's memory, their story is not just one of glory, it's one of caution. A tale written in fire and soot and the limits of breath, and now that breath is ours to guard. We live in the long aftermath of a chemical gamble, a planet that once overreached, a biosphere that pulled back just in time. We are the result not of excess, but of restraint. So, inhale, exhale, not just as a reflex, but as a reckoning, because oxygen made you. And if history teaches us anything, it's that it can unmake you, too, and maybe, just maybe. Wisdom lives not in how much we can take, but in knowing when to stop, when to steady the flame, when to breathe just enough without tipping the balance, when to notice the signs we once ignored, and when to listen. Because the air remembers everything we forget, and it doesn't forget easily. Not the fires that once danced across continents, not the creatures that breathed flame-bright air into oversized bodies, not the roots that died, fell, and compressed into coal. The atmosphere is more than gas, it is memory, carried not in words, but in chemical signatures, traces, isotopes, patterns buried in the breath of time. And those patterns didn't vanish. They echo still in our living world. The dragonfly flickering past your window is no giant. Its wings span mere inches, but it moves like an air, delicate, efficient, ancient. In its veins flows a blueprint older than most bones. Its ancestors soared when the sky held 35% oxygen, when the air itself could feed ambition. Meganeura is long gone, but its silhouette survives in ponds, in reeds, in the split-second shimmer of modern wings. Legacy species, that's what we call them, creatures that carry evolutionary echoes. Horseshoe crabs with blood that detects bacterial toxins, coelacanths with fins that almost became limbs, ginkgo trees with fan-shaped leaves unchanged for over 200 million years. These are not fossils, they are reminders of climates long past, of oxygen levels that once made the impossible real, and we walk among them, touch them, breathe with them. Even in the dirt beneath our feet, the past rises. Amber petrified resin from prehistoric trees holds air bubbles within it, tiny pockets of atmosphere, sealed for hundreds of millions of years. Some of these ancient capsules contain more oxygen than today's sky. We don't just imagine the Carboniferous. We sample it, hold it to the light, measure its ratios, compare it to our own exhale. And in doing so, we build bridges between then and now, between dragonflies and drones, between a world that nearly burned and one that still might. The fire hasn't gone out. It's just waiting, in coal seams, in carbon dioxide, in the trees that still fall and dry and drift toward ignition, in the lungs of creatures that never asked for the sky to change so fast, and in us. In the way our bodies recoil from bad air, crave clean breath. Remember at a molecular level how oxygen fuels not just life, but memory itself. We inherit more than genes. We inherit atmosphere, not just its contents, but its consequences. What made giants possible also made ecosystems fragile. What lifted wings also invited flame. What fed forests also laid the groundwork for collapse. To know this is not to fear the past. It's to understand the present, the insects in your garden, the amber in your drawer, the coal in your fireplace, the breath in your chest. All of them carry traces of a time when Earth inhaled deeper than it does now. A time when the air itself was a character in the story, shaping size, survival, fate. That time has passed. But the air remembers, and through it, so can we. So can we, but only if we're willing to look. Oxygen, once a gift, is now a variable, a clue, a data point in the long equation of planetary habitability. Scientists today don't just study the past for its own sake. They study it to ask the most pressing question of all: what happens next? Because ancient oxygen levels were never static. They rose and fell, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically, and every shift left fingerprints in tree rings, in ice cores, in the sulfur trapped in rock. We now have tools that can read these whispers, mass spectrometers that detect isotopes, models that simulate Earth's deep-time atmosphere. One of the most powerful of these is the GeoCarbSolf model, a vast reconstruction of how oxygen, carbon, and sulfur interacted over the last 600 million years. And the pattern is clear. Life changes oxygen. Oxygen changes life. When plants colonized land, they buried carbon. Oxygen rose. When volcanoes erupted for centuries, they flooded the air with carbon dioxide. Oxygen fell. When vast swamps spread across continents, photosynthesis outpaced respiration. The atmosphere bloomed. Then swamps dried, wildfires spread, and oxygen crashed again. This rhythm isn't random. It's systemic. A dance of life and fire, growth and decay, burial and burn. And we are not outside that dance. We are now a geological force. Our cities hum with energy pulled from ancient breath. Our machines exhale carbon that once fed ferns and forests. We don't just change the atmosphere, we edit its memory. We scramble a record written over hundreds of millions of years in less than 2 human lifetimes. That's why the past matters, because it holds the upper and lower bounds of Earth's breath. It shows us what happens when oxygen rises too high or falls too low. When fire becomes frequent, when life grows too large or collapses too fast, it offers us the only full-scale laboratory we'll ever get. So we measure charcoal in ancient coal. We count stomata on fossil leaves. We analyze oxygen isotopes in marine shells. Each piece tells us what the planet once tolerated and what pushed it past its limits. Some extinctions, we now believe, were triggered not by asteroids or volcanoes alone, but by changes in oxygen. Drops that stressed gills, surges that fueled uncontrollable fires, shifts that turned once stable ecosystems brittle. And today, we know our CO2 is rising. We know wildfires are growing. We know atmospheric dynamics are delicate. But we also know how to read the story behind those facts, because we've seen it before. In the swamps that burned, in the forests that vanished, in the skies that once fed giants and then let them fall. The Carboniferous is not just history. It is a mirror. And in that mirror, we glimpse our future not yet written, but increasingly familiar, not fated, but possible. Understanding ancient oxygen isn't about nostalgia, it's about foresight. Because if we can decode how Earth once breathed, we might just learn how to help it breathe again. To breathe is effortless until it's not. That's the lesson behind every spike and stumble in Earth's oxygen record. The Carboniferous wasn't just a time of giants, it was a time of tension, of ecosystems pushed to their upper limit. Because at 35% oxygen, the world became more alive, but also more fragile. And fragility isn't weakness, it's complexity under pressure. Oxygen is a powerful enabler. It fuels aerobic respiration, the process that allows complex life to extract immense energy from food. More oxygen, more energy. More energy, more biological potential. That's how insects grew wings like sails, how amphibians bulked into apex predators, how forests reached dozens of meters into the sky. The chemistry of breath became architecture. But that same chemistry had a cost. With every breath, oxygen also produces reactive oxygen species, highly unstable molecules that damage DNA, proteins, and cells. At 35%, those molecules multiply. Antioxidant systems in early animals may have worked overtime, But there was a ceiling, a point where cells couldn't keep up, where growth became toxicity. That's the paradox. The thing that made life big also made it burn, internally through oxidative stress, externally through continent-wide fires. When every plant is kindling, every spark becomes a catastrophe. Insects may have flown through the trees, but the trees themselves were ready to explode. And yet life persisted. It adapted, shifted, diversified. Some organisms evolved better oxygen regulation. Others avoided high oxygen habitats altogether. But the high plateau couldn't last. As the balance of burial and decay shifted, as swamps vanished and coal formation slowed, oxygen levels dropped. And with that drop, the giants vanished too. Their disappearance wasn't sudden. It unfolded in stages. First came reduced diversity, then shrinking size, then silence entombed in the rock layers that would later fuel our cities. Arthropods shrank, amphibians declined. Only those with lungs suited to lower oxygen and the ability to reproduce away from water thrived. The winners weren't the biggest, they were the most adaptable. That remains true today. The human body operates in a tight oxygen window. Too little, and cells suffocate. Too much, and cells corrode. Divers breathe carefully calibrated gas mixtures. Astronauts wear suits to prevent oxygen toxicity. Even modern medical incubators carefully regulate oxygen to avoid damaging premature infant lungs. In a world where every breath counts, precision matters. And yet we often forget how narrow the margin island. We forget that what's normal now, 21% oxygen, is not a law. It's a snapshot, a point in a volatile, ongoing story. A compromise struck between photosynthesis and fire, between burial and burn, and it's always in flux. So when we ask what 35% oxygen teaches us, the answer isn't just awe, it's humility. Because the planet that once made room for insect giants and amphibian titans barely makes room for us, as we are now. We are children of moderation, not in power, but in balance. And that balance is not guaranteed. It is maintained, day by day, breath by breath. That balance is not guaranteed, but sometimes it leaves behind survivors' living threads that stretch back into the deep past, pulling stories through time. We call them relics, we call them echoes, but they are alive, and they carry within them the quiet imprint of high oxygen. Look closely at the dragonfly, not the fossil, but the real one, the iridescent shimmer skimming the pond in your backyard. It is a descendant of air that once fed wings wider than your outstretched arms. It doesn't need 35% oxygen to live today, but its body plan, its neural circuitry, its mode of flight, those were born under different skies. There's something else too. Their breathing. Insects don't have lungs. They rely on tracheal tubes, a system of branching, air-filled passages that deliver oxygen directly to tissues. In modern atmospheres, this limits their size. But in a world where the air itself was denser with oxygen, those tubes worked more efficiently. Giant insects weren't just possible, they were inevitable. That same principle applies elsewhere. The ginkgo tree, sometimes called a living fossil, is another survivor from those volatile ages. It's not just old, it's unchanged. Fossils of ginkgo leaves from 270 million years ago are nearly identical to the ones fluttering in temple gardens today. The tree persisted through multiple mass extinctions, including the collapse of the swamps that once fueled Earth's oxygen high. Its tolerance for pollution, its slow growth, its unusual reproductive cycle, all clues to a lineage shaped by more chaotic times. In the oceans, we find other ghosts. Nautiluses, with their coiled shells and jet propulsion swimming, belong to a group that once flourished when oxygen levels were high in shallow seas. Today, they hover in deeper, more stable waters, retreating, but still breathing. Their survival is not dominance, it's resilience, a quiet holding on. Even mammals carry echoes. Our red blood cells, packed with hemoglobin, evolved under shifting oxygen conditions. The way we store oxygen, transport it, release it to cells that chemistry is ancient. It has endured fire, flood, drought, and ice. It has shaped everything from altitude tolerance in yaks to the endurance of long-distance runners. Every breath you take is processed by a system fine-tuned over eons of atmospheric change. And yet, this inheritance is fragile. The same creatures that once thrived at the edge of atmospheric extremes are now threatened by rapid, human-driven changes. Amphibians, those early land pioneers, are disappearing from ponds and forests worldwide. Insects, our oldest flyers, face declining populations, even in temperate zones. The great survivors are under stress, not from low oxygen this time, but from fragmentation, pollution, climate shifts. The echoes are fading, but they haven't vanished. We still walk under trees that remember. We still watch insects that evolved to ride hotter winds. We still breathe air that has carried life and fire for over 1 billion years. And when we understand that, we don't just see biology, we see history, breathing, blinking, pollinating history. And in that history lies both a warning and a hope. Hope doesn't always roar. Sometimes it rustles through leaves, or hovers on gossamer wings above still water, or curls in the spiral of a nautilus shell, drifting through memory-rich seas. Because when we ask what 35% oxygen means for us, not just as a number, but as a story, we return to a truth hidden in plain air. The atmosphere is not background. It is protagonist. It is architect. It is inheritance. We don't just live in air. We're made by it, shaped by its density, its rhythms, its generosity, and its restraint. Oxygen sculpted everything from the size of dragonfly wings to the pace of human thought. But oxygen doesn't act alone. It reflects. It responds. It waits for imbalance. The swamps of the Carboniferous didn't intend to make firewood. They just stored more carbon than the system could process. Trees grew with lignin, an innovation that few organisms could yet digest. So the forests fell, buried layer upon layer, building coal, building tension. And when microbes caught up, when fungi finally learned to decompose lignin, the cycle changed. Carbon stopped piling up. Oxygen stopped climbing. Fire spread. Giants fell. The lesson is not that progress is bad. It's that systems adapt. And sometimes, adaptation changes the rules. Today, we live inside one of those rule changes. The coal we now burn comes from those very swamps. It is the breath of ancient forests released in reverse. 100 million years of carbon unspooled in a century. The fire is back, not in a slow, seasonal burn, but in wild blazes that leap continents, in engines, in furnaces, in feedback loops, spinning faster than biology can blink. But that's not the end of the story, because the air remembers, and it also responds. We see it in coral reefs gasping under warmth, in insects shifting ranges up mountainsides, in pollen seasons that start earlier, last longer, in fire scars that etch themselves into tree rings. The oxygen isn't vanishing, but its partners are changing. Carbon rising, heat accelerating, equilibriums tilting. And us? We stand, once again, in a pivotal moment. We are the only species to have read the fossil record and understood it. To hold coal in one hand and a satellite in the other. To measure ancient oxygen in amber bubbles while watching wildfire plumes from orbit. The past gave us the tools. The future asks us what we'll do with them. So what can 35% oxygen teach us? That abundance brings volatility. That complexity comes with cost. That resilience is rarely found in excess. And that every breath is both memory and decision. Because when we inhale, we take in history. And when we exhale, we shape legacy. The air we breathe today holds echoes of dragonfly wings, of swamp-rooted trees, of a sky that once teetered on the edge of combustion. That sky is quieter now. But the story isn't over. It's in your lungs. It's in the wind. It's in the coal and in the code. The air remembers. Now, it's our turn to listen, to choose, to shape what the next breath becomes. Because atmosphere is not just science, it is biography. And every species, every forest, every ember has written a chapter in it. We are writing the next one, together, carefully, with fire still at our backs and breath in our hands. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long spiral through time, breathing alongside us as we traced the rise, fall, and echo of oxygen across Earth's deep past. If this story helped you feel a little wonder, sparked a deeper breath, or offered focus in a noisy world, thank you for spending this hour with us. I wonder what detail will stay with you tonight. Was it the shimmer of dragonfly wings? The hush of ancient forests? The fire locked in stone? Whether it was the dry clatter of chitin on wind, the fossilized breath of swamps turned to coal, or the fragile equation of atmosphere and life, these memories become the thread we share, a thread stretched between you, me, and all who've ever paused to listen. If something stirred in you, feel free to leave it in the comments like a quiet offering to the archive we're building together. If you'd like to keep walking paths like this through oxygen, through extinction, through whatever breathes next, consider liking, subscribing, and joining us for the next story we uncover. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,